Yep.
That's on.
Yep.
No.
By John.
Testing, testing, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
All right, good morning, everyone. I would like to call to order this public roundtable of the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. It is 11:11 a.m. on Monday, March 6th, 2023. And we are conducting this roundtable in person in room 412 of the John A. Wilson Building. The hearing is also streaming on the DC Council website and YouTube at CM Brooke Pinto. I am Councilmember Brooke Pinto, representing Ward 2 and Chairwoman of the committee. There have been more than 530 homicides committed with a gun in the District of Columbia since January 2023. That number is nearly double the number of gun-related homicides in the preceding 3-year period. Gun violence has affected the lives of thousands more, from the real lasting trauma experienced by the families of victims and perpetrators of this violence, to the fear felt by residents eager to see an end to the gun violence plaguing their communities. And the question I hear most often from residents is, what is the district doing to curb the violence, and why aren't we seeing more progress? The statistics make clear that gun violence is one of the largest crises facing district residents today. And disturbingly, the rates of gun violence are on the rise. We must take immediate and decisive action to address this spate of violence, including reducing the number of dangerous and illegal guns in the district. This past Friday and Saturday, the committee convened the first 2 of this series of roundtables on gun violence in the district. And at those roundtables, we heard testimony from public witnesses, including community leaders, service providers, and most critically, district residents whose lives and the lives of their loved ones have been directly affected by gun violence. The testimony we received at these roundtables was incredibly powerful. Notably, in the nearly dozen hours of testimony the committee heard on Friday and Saturday, the issue of gun violence itself rarely came up. Instead, we heard pleas for the council and the government to support greater access to mental health services for those who have experienced gun violence, and better supports and parenting resources for struggling families. We heard from residents about the incredible importance of police officers being a part of their communities they work in, and the critical need for those seeking to roll out gun violence prevention initiatives to engage directly and regularly with impacted communities in devising those programs. We also heard frustration from residents not only on the lack of progress in addressing these issues, but the failure in their eyes for district leaders to listen to the residents and communities most directly impacted by gun violence. I left those hearings humbled and with a message that whatever this committee and those at this table may do in the coming months and years ahead to address gun violence, that we must do more to engage directly with the community and ensure that what we're doing not only sounds right, but is informed by the actual needs of our community as communicated. I urge each of you to watch these hearings and recordings, which are available on the DC Council website and on YouTube, again at CM Brooke Pinto, to hear directly from the residents most directly impacted, who have powerful and tangible ideas on how we can all do better. So today is the 3rd and final roundtable of this series. With us today are leaders from many of the local and federal agencies leading this critical work in our city. Certainly, the district has invested a considerable amount of brain power and resources to reducing violent crime in the district and gun violence in particular. So today we are joined by our Ward 1 colleague, Councilmember Brianne Nadeau, our at-large colleague, Councilmember Robert White, Attorney General Brian Schwab, Lindsey Appiah, Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice, Chief Conte of the Metropolitan Police Department, from the Office of the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia, Ilana Suttenberg, Special Counsel for Policy and Legislative Affairs, and Julianne Johnston, Chief of the Superior Court Division. Also with us are several national experts on gun violence and prevention. They are Seema Gajwani. Ms. Gajwani serves as Special Counsel for Juvenile Justice Reform and Chief of the Restorative Justice Program Section at the DC Office of the Attorney General. And prior to this position, Ms. Gajwani ran the Criminal Justice Program at the Public Welfare Foundation in Washington, D.C., funding efforts to improve criminal justice and juvenile justice systems across the country, with a focus on pretrial detention reform and prosecutorial culture change. Dr. Joseph Richardson Jr., who serves as the Joel and Kim Feller Professor of African American Studies and Medical Anthropology at the University of Maryland, and one of 8 scholars selected as an inaugural University of Maryland Empower Professor. Dr. Richardson's research centers on gun violence, community violence, violent firearm injury, mental health trauma, and violence reduction interventions for Black boys and young Black men. Dr. Mallory O'Brien, who is joining us virtually today, is the founding director of the Milwaukee Homicide Review Commission, or MHRC, a real-time multi-agency, multidisciplinary case review process, which uses data to drive policy for violence prevention, primarily firearm violence. The MHRC has been collecting and applying comprehensive criminal justice data since 2005 and non-fatal shootings since 2006. She currently serves on 2 interagency personnel agreements, Bureau of Justice Assistance and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, supporting overdose prevention, overdose fatality review, and public safety and health interventions. And we have Dr. Daniel Webster, who is also joining us virtually today, who serves as the Bloomberg Professor of American Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where he is a distinguished scholar at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Dr. Webster has published widely on the impacts of gun policies on homicides, suicides, and gun trafficking that led studies of community violence intervention programs, youth violence prevention, and intimate partner violence. He also serves as a member of the Council on Criminal Justice's Working Group on Violent Crime. I also want to note that Doctors Richardson and Webster were recently awarded a 4-year grant from Arnold Ventures to evaluate the district's violence interruption programs. So thank you so much to each of our agency leaders and subject matter experts who have joined us here today. And to be clear, today's roundtable does not include a representative from each and every one of district's agencies that plays a role in this critical work. In fact, every agency in our city has a role to play in ensuring that conditions that lead to crime and violence do not proliferate. But the people at this table work closely with all of those agencies and groups in these partnerships are critical in our work in gun violence prevention efforts. Something I'm confident that will be central to today's discussion. But the leaders with us today are most directly engaged on a day-to-day basis with promoting public safety and addressing violence and criminal activity. And as such, this is a table of some of the leaders who are most directly responsible and accountable to DC residents for reducing gun violence. As those joining us today can see, today's roundtable is arranged a bit differently than a traditional hearing. Rather than a traditional panel of witnesses with committee members on the dais, I hope to lead the group here in a broader discussion, serving more as a moderator role in this group discussion. Although I will be directing questions at specific individuals today, I encourage folks with other thoughts to lean in, participate, speak up, even ask one another questions. This is meant to be a group facilitated conversation. I hope this format will allow us to have a more organic discussion about this important work and perhaps facilitate some connections that may not be able to bear out in a traditional hearing format. And finally, I envision these 3 roundtables that we've had these last several days to be the start of a longer ongoing conversation with the committee about gun violence in the district, including our efforts to swiftly and effectively address it, reduce it, and prevent it. So I'd like to begin by going around the table and having each panelist share their name, title, and briefly what role your office or research plays in our work to reducing gun violence. I will begin. I am Councilmember Brooke Pinto, Chairwoman of the Committee on the Judiciary and Public Safety. I convened this roundtable and the 2 roundtables held this past Friday and Saturday because I believe that addressing gun violence is the largest and most important challenge facing the district today. Next to my right, please go ahead.
Morning. Thank you for having me. Is this on? Good morning. Thank you for having me, Councilmember Pinto and Councilmember Nadeau and White. It's an honor to be here. My name is Seema Gajwani. I work at the Office of the Attorney General for Attorney General Brian Schwab. I am Special Counsel on Juvenile Justice Reform. I also lead the office's Restorative Justice Program. We work directly with prosecutors in our office to help focus on behavior change of young people who are in the justice system and helping victims of crime heal after the trauma of victimization.
Good morning, Brian Schwab, Attorney General. Chairwoman Pinto, thank you for convening this roundtable. In my travels, both as a candidate and over the last 60 days as Attorney General, there's no issue more on people's minds today than public safety. And when people don't feel safe in their neighborhoods, we don't get to the other really important issues we all have to get to as leaders in the city. I'm delighted at the framing of today that we are as leaders coming together and putting our arms together to figure out how to address this. Linking arms as opposed to pointing fingers is what people who elected us are expecting us to do. It's not particularly soothing when we talk about the fact that our gun violence challenge is no different than gun violence challenges that people are facing all over the country. In urban, suburban, rural settings, we have too many illegal guns in community. I'm also finding that people don't really want to have an argument or a conversation about what the AG's office does relative to what the U.S. Attorney's office does relative to different parts of government. People who elected us expect us as government officials and leaders to figure out what to do. And I'm delighted to be invited to participate in the conversation. And I can promise you that the 700 folks at the AG's office wake up every day trying to figure out what we can do. We have one sliver in terms of juvenile justice, but we also see a lot of other aspects that create the environment in which crime and violence are happening in our city. And all of us are dialed in on how we come together as an agency. And I'm glad we're all here together to talk about it. So thank you for convening us.
Thank you for inviting me, Chairwoman Pinto, and the other council members. I'm Joseph Richardson, a professor at the University of Maryland, College Park in the Department of African American Studies and Anthropology, and also a professor at the University of Maryland School of Medicine in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health. I come to this work primarily as a gun violence researcher who investigates gun violence, trauma, and violent injury among young Black men and Black boys. I'm specifically a qualitative researcher, so my research is much about understanding the context of violent injury and what that looks like and how to translate that data into innovative interventions. One of the things that my research cuts across in terms of translational science is the co-founder of the Hospital Intervention Program at the University of Maryland Capital Region Health, which I directed for 2 years, and we were funded DC Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants. So I have a very intimate knowledge in terms of the young men and women who are survivors of firearm injury in the district, but I also serve currently as the co-chair of the Violence Fatality Review for the District of Columbia. Many of my colleagues who are members of that committee are here today. And that committee convenes monthly to assess homicides in the district through a multi-agency collaborative. And the last thing, as you mentioned, Dr. Daniel Webster and I, who is also on the Zoom call, will be leading a study evaluating community violence intervention, specifically street outreach in the district, to understand the effectiveness of violence intervention programs in the district, specifically under the Office of Attorney General, as well as the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. So I'm glad to be here.
Good morning, everybody. I am Wesley Parsons, the Assistant Chief for the Investigative Services Bureau at the Metropolitan Police Department. So I'm tasked with the investigations in the city to include our homicides and all of our district detectives that handle investigations into gun violence.
Good morning. I'm Robert Conte, Chief of Police here in Washington, D.C. In addition to that, a DC resident, father of two, born and raised in this city, held Leslie's position prior to him having that responsibility. Also, the position of head of homicide here in the District of Columbia. And in my role, I have a unique opportunity, although it'd be unfortunate sometimes, to engage with people who have been victimized by offenders in our community, but also people who are survivors of other people who have been victimized by crimes in our city. So I'm happy to be part of this discussion. I have the responsibility of assigning resources or designating resources that we have within the police department and partnering with our partners in the federal space, be it the U.S. Attorney's Office or FBI, ATF, DEA, essentially as a force multiplier to assist us in our investigation of cases all across the city. So thank you for the opportunity to be here and speak.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Lindsey Appiah. I'm the Acting Deputy Mayor for Public Safety and Justice. In that role, I am responsible for helping our agencies, both the 12 agencies in the Public Safety and Justice cluster, and all of the agencies across the district and our federal and local partners to advance the mayor's priorities around public safety, which she's made very clear to us repeatedly that there's nothing more important than the safety of our residents, both their actual safety and the feeling of safety. And so our priorities now are certainly focused on reducing gun violence and reducing juvenile violence. But one of the things that the mayor says to us across the board is that it's our responsibility to have solutions and interventions for all types of crime, because whether it's gun violence or car theft or any of the things that we see in our city, it's our responsibility to help our residents be safe and feel safe. And so, like I said, there are 12 agencies in the Public Safety and Justice cluster. One of ours is here with the Metropolitan Police Department, but we range from what many would see as beginning of the system, right? Front door of the juvenile justice system with the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services, all the way through the Mayor's Office of Returning Citizens and a lot of others in there. The other thing, we provide strategic oversight, coordination, support for our agencies to make sure that they're meeting their priorities and our overarching priorities as set by the mayor, but also to provide, I like to think of it as the connective tissue that pulls together the different parts of our government, because as you said, Councilwoman, it very much is, in order for us to make our city safer, and public safety is more than just the public safety and justice entities. It's all of our government partners. So we lead in our office a number of interagency, cross-cluster initiatives, public safety task forces, and otherwise to really bring together whole of government solutions to all of the issues that cut against public safety. And so that's my role in a nutshell, we'll say. Thanks.
Good morning. My name is Ilana Suttenberg. I'm the Special Counsel for Policy and Legislative Affairs at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I do want to thank this committee, Councilmember Pinto, other council members for hosting this hearing, for inviting us to testify, and for really prioritizing the issue of gun violence in our communities. We, along with everyone here and the community, have been appalled by the rise in gun violence, by the rise of people possessing firearms, using those firearms to shoot at people and murdering people with those. And that is something that we are absolutely devoting our resources to, and along with everyone else here joining and saying that that is unacceptable. We are committed as the U.S. Attorney's Office to prevention of gun violence in all forms. Prevention does include prosecution. Prosecution can prevent a person's conduct from escalating or repeating. We absolutely want to work with all of our partners to prevent violent crime in every way that we can before it happens at all. But when it does happen, we want to when we're unable to stop the violence from happening, we want to prevent it from escalating and repeating. And when we're unable to prevent it from escalating or repeating, we want to hold the people accountable who have committed that violent crime. And where we have sufficient admissible evidence, we will prosecute the people who have perpetrated that violent crime. And so we appreciate all of these different people being here to speak to all the aspects of the justice system. And we're certainly committed to working with all of you and helping the community of DC.
Hi, good morning. My name is Julianne Johnston, and I'm the Chief of the Superior Court Division at the U.S. Attorney's Office, working closely with Ilana. And I echo Ilana and my colleagues' thanks to the chairwoman for holding this hearing because in our division, which prosecutes most adult violent crime in the city, gun violence is at the top of our minds every day as well. Our division has over 160 attorneys who dedicate their work to prosecuting violent crime in DC. And we have a very dedicated and talented team of prosecutors, of advocates who work with families and with our victims and witnesses who see gun violence, our children who see good violence, and everyone in this division is committed to doing whatever we can to do our part. An important part of that is working with all of those at this table. So thank you for convening this today.
Chairperson Pinto, thank you for convening this and hosting this series of meetings about gun violence, which is one of the most serious and important things that people in this city are seeing and experiencing right now and talking to us about. I come to this as somebody who has lost members of my own family to gun violence in the district, who has been at the wrong end of a pistol, who has been outside of courtrooms with family members, not on gun issues, but it have been the family member of people being prosecuted here in the city. Now as a father of two daughters, hearing gunshots and worrying about their future, their safety, and their mental health. And so I believe that so many of us share the experiences of the residents that we try to represent. And in my conversations with families and with residents, gun violence prevention is a repeated concern. It is something that we are hearing about every day at this point. And we have to prevent and address gun violence in real time to make sure residents are safe and that they feel safe. And we know that addressing gun violence, because of the things we've done in the past, is going to require us to get to the root causes of these issues, which is not an easy task. Our challenge with gun violence stems from complex societal issues. They're influenced by neighboring jurisdictions. And while we don't control the laws of other jurisdictions, we do control the laws of our jurisdiction. We know that there's a connection between gun violence and trauma, toxic masculinity, poverty, education. And if we don't address the underlying issues, we're going to keep coming back to this place. I want us to be clear-eyed as we convene the right people around the table. There are people around this table, in fact, everybody, that I admire greatly. I want us to be clear-eyed about two things. One, people are scared in this city right now, and it is our job to do something about it. The other is that the approach we've taken in the past has never worked for any sustainable period of time. So our challenge, a significant one, is to figure out what does gun safety, violence prevention look like going forward, not just how do we do more of what we did before that I think hasn't worked for our city. So I'm just so grateful for you convening this and happy that I can be a part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Pinto, for holding this roundtable series on gun violence prevention and reduction. I'm Ward 1 Councilmember Brianne Nadeau. As a mom raising two kids in DC and as a ward council member, nobody needs to tell me that gun violence is a serious issue facing the district right now. Just last week in Ward 1, we lost one of our lifelong residents due to gun violence, with another resident wounded. And despite all of our efforts as a government, it's still too easy to access firearms, and too many people are still using them to resolve conflicts. People throughout the district are asking what the police, the council, the mayor, and the rest of district government are doing to keep us safe from crime. From my years on the council, it's clear to me that we must address public safety holistically. No one tool is going to solve crime, and as our chief said, there is no magic formula. The solution lies in a mix of short-term immediate interventions and longer-term measures, and I support both. On Friday, Madam Chair, I joined you to hear from public witnesses on this topic, and today I'm glad to have the chance to talk with our partners in government. I'll have to leave for a bit to join the mayor and the chief for a press conference, also about public safety in Ward 1, but I plan to return to join the rest of the discussion. Since my time on the council, our legislative branch has passed laws to give our government the tools to address safety, and today is an important opportunity to hear about how those are being implemented. What are we doing to prevent and resolve the conflicts that lead to violence? How is the Pathways program and other programs that provide opportunity helping residents thrive? How successful are we at getting guns off the street? What new technologies do we need to get ahead of? Are we implementing our red flag law? What are we doing to recruit the best and brightest to fill vacancies at MPD? And how are we working with our federal partners on prosecuting crime and sentencing that gets dangerous people off the street? I look forward to hearing from our government witnesses today. Addressing crime is complex and challenging. And thankfully, we have a caring and compassionate community that is united in wanting a safe place to live. We have thousands of people working day and night to prevent crime in the first place and to respond when it occurs. We'll continue to try out new ideas of proven methods that residents and others know will bring crime down in our community. And I welcome any and all suggestions and look forward to hearing everybody's ideas in today's roundtable. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you for convening this hearing and this opportunity to hear from stakeholders and from our government officials. I'm Matt Fruman. I'm the new Ward 3 council member and somewhat new to this discussion. This weekend, I had the opportunity to attend another one of the hearings that you conducted with public witnesses, and it was riveting and compelling. To hear from people in communities that feel traumatized in so many different ways, and to hear about the perspectives of what are the kinds of things that can be done to solve the issues. I'll tell you, Chief Conte, that one of the comments made by somebody giving testimony was the answer's right in front of you, and it's Chief Conte and people like Chief Conte. People who come from the community, who are connected to the community, and who can be a part of the solution. I don't want to kid you that everybody said that, but one person did. Then on Sunday, I attended a different community meeting in Cleveland Park. Ron Moten and Jeffrey Anderson talking about their book, and another series of just compelling testimonies with a little bit of a different perspective than what I heard on Saturday. And we're all grappling with this fundamental question of how do we make sure, as Councilmember White was saying, that people are safe and feel safe, and how do we do it in ways where we're not deepening trauma in communities where there's a cycle at work that is so powerful for us to try to remedy. And it's not going to be that we just do the same things over and over again. It has to be that we come up with additional strategies, maybe strategies that have been tried in the past and that seem to be working and that have been not being used now. But let's work together towards the goal of addressing these issues, not just in the immediate day, but getting on a platform where we're building to a safer and safer city, and all of us can feel that way. I look forward to this discussion today and being a part of that effort going forward.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Fruman, and thank you for joining me all day on Saturday. I appreciate that. Next, I want to invite Dr. OBrien and Dr. Webster to introduce yourself and your title. What brings you to this work on Zoom? We can start with Dr. OBrien.
Well, good morning. It's still morning for me. Really nice to be here. Appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you. I am also a colleague of Dr. Webster's at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions at the Bloomberg School of Public Health. My real focus over the last 20 years or so has been focusing on public health and public safety partnerships and really taking a public health approach to violence prevention and overdose prevention. And I was fortunate to come to DC, I want to say it was 2017, might have been 2018, and talk to people about what the homicide review process looks like and how they might be able to implement it within the district. And I'm really excited to see that they not only were able to start the homicide reviews, but they also started a number of other reviews. So I'm happy to be here to talk about all the work that we did in Milwaukee, some of the new exciting things that are happening now at the Center for Gun Violence Solutions, and just be part of your conversation and see how my expertise can help all of you. I think one thing that's important to note too is that listening to all of you describe what your goal is for today, I think the homicide review process can do that for you, in that it brings everybody to the table. It really focuses on data, real-time data, aggregate data, case level data to really understand where there are those missed opportunities for intervention and prevention. And it's done in a non-blaming, non-finger pointing way where you bring in all of your partners, including the community, to come up with the solutions. So it's a process that allows people to come together and be part of the solution. And when they're part of the solution, the implementation becomes that much easier. Happy to talk more about it later. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Daniel.
Hi, good morning. I'm Daniel Webster, Bloomberg Professor of American Health at Johns Hopkins. I've been working on the problem of gun violence for about 30 years now. Study of a range of different approaches from gun policy to its enforcement, community violence intervention strategies, and other approaches. I also developed the first course in a school of public health to focus on violence prevention as a public health problem using public health tools and approaches. I'm just so pleased that Dr. OBrien and Dr. Richardson are part of this conversation, both scholars who I respect greatly and work with now. And as Dr. OBrien articulated, really the homicide shooting review process is foundational to a public health approach. Public health approach is nothing really magical. It's pretty practical. It's data-driven. And pardon me, I think much of our discussion will focus on individuals at greatest risk or who are currently involved in violence, and we're going to focus very much on how to address and steer those individuals in ways that are not picking up a gun to address problems. But fundamental to a public health approach is a deep understanding of the environmental context in which violence repeatedly occurs. We know very well that gun violence is distributed in a very concentrated way along lines that map onto structural racism, disinvestment, and a variety of other challenges that faces the district as well as other cities. So I hope our conversation will also not, address these environmental conditions and think long-term about how we have a sustainable way to reduce gun violence in the district. And again, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to divide our discussion today into 4 broad segments, which will be about 30 to 40 minutes each, based off of some of the key problems and solutions that the agencies here today are focused on. So first will be reducing the flow of illegal guns into the district. Second will be violence interruption initiatives and other interventions. Third, youth programming, diversion, and rehabilitation. And fourth, after an incidence of gun violence, interagency planning, action, and coordination. Of course, these are broad topics, each made up of a number of complex issues, and we could spend all day talking about each of these and many more, but I want to really focus today on specifics for how we can enhance collaboration work, particularly where we agree on the appropriate approach. I want to start off with the discussion today on our efforts to reduce the flow of illegal guns into the district. This is an issue that urban jurisdictions are facing across the country because of Congress's inaction. And Chief Conte, Assistant Chief Parsons, can you provide us with some of the context of what MPD is currently doing and how you're working with our federal partners to reduce the number of guns coming into the district?
Yeah, absolutely. As you're aware from the chief's testimony during our brief out previously. We have a strong partnership with our federal law enforcement partners, with our partners at the ATF. We currently have detectives. So a typical task force where we assign members of our department to that federal agency, we're doing that in reverse now with our members at the ATF. We have our detectives who are embedded with the ATF. We have detectives that follow up on these guns that are recovered. They look at these guns, they look at time to crime, they look at when the gun was purchased, they look at who the purchaser was. And we have detectives that follow that to see if we have trafficking going on. They follow up, as you know, guns leave traces. We can compare those fired casings to casings from other scenes to see if we have links. Our detectives are following up on that. The ATF has also been instrumental in helping us when it comes to firearms examinations with the current state of affairs with DFS. They currently do our firearms exam for us and provide us with that information. So they test fire each recovered gun in the city and provide us with the information we need in order to conduct our investigations. We also have strong partnerships with the FBI, with our Violent Crimes Task Force. They assist us in many ways, many investigative needs that we have when it comes to carjackings and violent crimes. The FBI assists us with that. The DEA also works strongly with our Violent Crime Suppression Division. And I'll stop there as I want to make sure I hit all the points you want me to hit, and I just don't want to ramble on. So if you have some follow-ups, I'll take them.
And certainly the embedded investigative function, I imagine could be very useful.
Right.
Dr. Webster, do you have other thoughts on how other jurisdictions have been effective in curbing the flow of illegal guns, particularly within a regional context that might have different gun control laws on the books than their neighboring states and, of course, in the federal government?
Yes, excuse me, I'll just first acknowledge perhaps the obvious, which is an incredible challenge given the huge gaps we have in federal and many state gun laws. But clearly, partnerships of the type just described are really critical to it, and just the amount of resources that are devoted. I think again, you know, what I have seen is in New York, for example, where I think over 80% of the guns used in crime in New York City are from outside the state. NYPD has developed a pretty substantial unit with a lot of resources working directly with ATF. So they've been at it for a very long time. They've made some incredible cases. And quite honestly, it's hard to pinpoint the precise impact of those efforts. But there's one study that I can point to of a similar collaborative endeavor in Massachusetts that did document a significant reduction in a key indicator of guns being diverted for criminal use in Massachusetts. So this is really hard to do, and it's resource intensive, and you know, data are really the key in this. A new problem, of course, that I know we're seeing in the district and many other cities is the problem of ghost guns and the enormous challenges because you don't have a serial number, you don't have anything to follow up there. But developing, you know, good investigations to try to get where those guns are coming from. I think maybe, you know, again, as we look ahead down the road, maybe, you know, an area for more focus.
Thank you so much, Dr. Webster. And I think that's a good segue into ghost guns. And again, if anybody has thoughts on this or as we're discussing, please feel free to jump in. But as we think about recovering the guns that may have been used in a crime, it's important that there's a message to the public that there will be a certainty of consequence. Attorney General Schwab or Ms. Johnston or Ms. Suttenberg, can you discuss what evidence is needed in building a strong case once a gun is recovered? And what would you say are common hurdles in papering a gun possession case and how those issues can be addressed as you move forward?
Sure, thank you. Yes, we are seeing a rise in ghost guns. That is certainly something that we are all concerned about. How can these be tracked? We are seeing a rise in machine guns, Glock switches that are able to turn a semi-automatic weapon into an automatic weapon that allows somebody to discharge bullets at an incredibly rapid pace and kill more people. We are committed to investigating these cases. We're committed to, I'm sorry, am I getting some feedback now? Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay, great. So we are committed to investigating those cases in all parts of our office, and we're committed to charging those cases. I'll let my colleague Julianne perhaps speak a little bit more toward charging in Superior Court, but I do want to emphasize that where there is sufficient admissible evidence, we will charge gun cases. I think that that's important for the community to be aware of, that we do charge those cases. There are reasons where we cannot charge a case due to lack of evidence, but we are very committed to charging those cases. And the last point I just wanted to make before I turn it to Ms. Johnson is the reason that we're so concerned about the gun possession cases, which we are, is because we don't want people to use those guns to commit violent crimes. So I think it is crucial that we're all committed to prosecuting a gun possession case, but I can't overemphasize that we're committed to prosecuting the violent crimes as well, because that is the manifestation of the guns when people use those guns to harm other people, kill people in our community, that we have certainly devoted significant resources to combating violent crime in that respect. So I'll turn to Ms. Johnston if she has any additional thoughts to offer.
Yeah, so we are in daily communication with MPD about gun possession arrests, and for those that we cannot charge at intake, how we can improve them so they could be later charged. So one way that we often improve cases and kind of bring them back after they're, quote, no papered is through DNA testing. And so we work with MPD to try to do DNA testing, for example, where you have a number of people in the car where a firearm is recovered. How do we prove which of those individuals in the car possess that gun? There are other follow-on investigative techniques that MPD and our office work together on, such as search warrants and looking at social media, other avenues to prove who had possession of the gun. And that is one hurdle that we often face in prosecuting at arrest. Obviously, MPD standard is probable cause, and then we need to ensure we have sufficient evidence to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt. But on these cases and violent crime cases, we often are looking for the community's help and members of our community who know about gun violence or gun possessions that can provide that information to MPD, provide information to our office about surveillance video they may have, other ways to help build cases that we can prove beyond a reasonable doubt, because as Ms. Suttenberg said, we will prosecute those cases where we can prove them at trial. And our concern is their later use in harming a member of the community.
Just for people's awareness, they may have not seen the chief's testimony. So ghost guns are a considerable concern, right? We went from 25 recovered in 2018 to 524 in 2022. But I'm always want us in some respects to be aware of the issue, but also where we have opportunity, which is that even with those numbers, which is highly unacceptable, and the fact that MPD recovered, I think it's 36% more guns last year overall than the previous year, which is showing that the flow of guns into our city is up. Ghost guns accounted for, I think it's 16% of those guns that were recovered by MPD. So there's still this 84%, right? Like, not that we don't focus on how we can get better on tracing ghost guns and really stopping what we're seeing, which is higher lethality with the Glock switches and otherwise. This is why one of the things that our residents, or one of the things the mayor said at our meeting with the ANCs is the anxiety in residents is comparable to how, she felt, what she felt when she was growing up, right, in the 80s in the district. And a lot of that is because of the large number of gunshots they're hearing. right? Like that is part of it, is the feeling of hearing more and higher number of gunshots, which is when we talk about the Glock switches or otherwise that allow people to fire up. We have to focus on that, but we also need to keep in mind that 84% of our guns that are recovered are traditional guns. So what are the things we can do to make sure that we're improving whatever it takes, both to stop the flow of those into our city and also the removal and the prosecution as we try to figure out better ways, right? Like, kind of to address what are, it's all challenging, but even more challenging, untraceable, self-manufactured or other guns. So I put that because it's always that balance of, I never want our residents, these are very challenging issues, but there's always things that we can do. And so like we're hope givers, right? Like in very difficult situations, we always want people to know that, you know what? We're going to work with all of the tools that we have to get better at our investigations of those 84% while also building new investigatory tools for the 16%.
So I want to comment that much of the prosecutorial work that you see out of the Office of Attorney General is very much like you see at the U.S. Attorney's Office. If a young person is accused of a possession or use of a gun in a crime, just like an adult who might be prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney, it's close collaboration with MPD, both at the time of arrest, the possibility of making an arrest. We've had a great collaborative relationship through our 24-hour hotline, where in real time, our prosecutors are on the phone with MPD officers about whether there is sufficient evidence, where there might be additional evidence that could be gathered. Sometimes after, if there is not enough evidence at the time to make a charge, we're working on follow-up. And I think the point about social media is a very important one to remember, because so much of what we're seeing is the disrespecting of kids on the internet and using Instagram and other things, where when a previous generation was doing neighborhood disrespecting, it was just confined in the neighborhood to those folks who were around to hear it. And now that stays forever on the social media and is spread around. So oftentimes the actual beginnings of these disputes are recorded on social media, and using the forensics to get that information is critical. So as you heard the U.S. Attorney's Office say, the Office of Attorney General is prosecuting every possession case or use of a gun case where we have sufficient constitutionally acquired evidence to do that. Gun possession cases are sometimes difficult to make. We have some challenges with some of the forensic capacities with fingerprinting and other things that we always need to get better at. But one of the things that the Office of Attorney General can do that's a little bit unlike other traditionally purely criminal offices is that we're also trying to use all of our civil and regulatory authorities to try to keep ghost guns away from the District of Columbia. We brought a lawsuit against Polymer 80, which was a manufacturer of gun kits, of ghost gun kits that was selling to consumers in the District of Columbia. We used our Consumer Protection Procedures Act to sue Polymer 80, got a very substantial judgment against Polymer 80. So there's an example where we're looking for civil remedies where we can hit gun manufacturers and traffickers in their pocketbook. Exploring design defect type theories. Unfortunately, as most people know, Congress and the NRA has done a good job of protecting a lot of gun manufacturers from civil liability, but good creative lawyering and thought process around design defect, like those giggle switches that are turning semi-automatic weapons into automatic weapons, and whether there's some design defect theories to be brought, are important. We're working with ATF on some rulemaking, particularly around whether or not the ghost gun kits should be covered by the federal laws and regulations on serialization. So along with, I think, 10 or 11 other AGs last year, we argued for successfully a modification of the rule regarding serialization of guns that are ghost guns. Last September, interestingly, we joined several other AGs in urging and then applauding Amex, Visa, and MasterCard on creating a special merchant category for when people are using credit cards to buy ammunition and guns, so that there now is an additional body of information that can be used to try to track the buying and selling of guns. So we're looking to expand where we can civilly, when sometimes the criminal avenues don't provide a complete opportunity. And then the last thing I'll say that we're focused on, well, two other things. We're doing an awful lot of Second Amendment litigation in light of the Bruin decision last year by the Supreme Court, defending the issue about where reasonable gun control laws can be upheld under the Second Amendment, questions of guns on the metro, guns on buses, guns in houses of worship, under the new analysis that the Supreme Court has set forth for Second Amendment work. And finally, we think it's very important to be engaged in a public education campaign on how lawful guns are properly stored, training. Too often we hear about people dying by suicide, lawfully obtained guns getting into the wrong hands. And so we want to use public education as another way of keeping people safe around guns.
Chair Pinto, can I ask a couple quick questions? I appreciate us starting at this part of the conversation because there are so many factors in gun violence. Some have more significant impact than others. For instance, obviously, if we could stem the flow of guns into the district, we have less of a challenge with gun violence inside the district. So my first question is for the Assistant Chief. Are the majority of guns coming into the city one by one, or are they coming into the city in batches and then being distributed?
So it's a great question, council member. And as I said, with our partnership with ATF, with our NIBIN investigations unit, that's one avenue we look in. We have seen the one by one, and we have seen a couple occurrences of batches, as you referred to it, of guns coming in. Those cases take a little time to put together and peel through. And that's the great thing with our partnership with the ATF. They have made several good trafficking cases during our partnership, but to say that, you know, to put it in one basket or the other is kind of hard to do. I think that you have guns that trickle up. The source states of firearms hasn't changed much over the years. I think Virginia is number one, and then it moves to Maryland and then Georgia, and I might have them out of order, but they haven't changed over the years. We've seen the consistency of where guns originate from coming into the district. So it's not a great answer to your question, but I think we see a little bit of both, but it's really hard to point to which way is truly the way they get here.
I appreciate it. And then my follow-up question to either Attorney General Schwab or our colleagues from the U.S. Attorney's Office, in terms of prosecuting manufacturers. I mean, for God's sake, Safeway grocery store can stop a shopping cart from working the second you get beyond its parking lot. But gun manufacturers, it is you cannot believe that they can't do something to guns to prohibit them from being usable or used once they're in the wrong hands, but they are not required or incentivized to go down that road. Is there anything we can do to get at manufacturers to push them to make modifications that would reduce the harm to innocent people? That's all.
So Councilmember White, you know, just by way of background, the federal statute that was passed kind of referred to as PLACA, but it's basically an acronym that gives broad liability to gun manufacturers and gun sellers for crimes committed by people who use their guns, even though under traditional criminal or tort theory, you have a foreseeable event that is going to occur. You have the ability to prevent the misuse, but candidly, the NRA and Friends of the Guns have done a great job with our friends on Capitol Hill in getting very broad federal protections that preempt state theories. So it's a difficult legal case to make right now for civil liability, although what I think creative jurisdictions are doing, including the District of Columbia, is to think where we might use our consumer protection theories, where we might be able to broaden some nuisance theories to get at a civil claim for the gun manufacturers and sellers who are putting guns out with a foreseeability that they're going to be used to hurt people.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General. So I think kind of we have too many guns in society, right? I absolutely agree with that. That is a problem in the district. It is a problem across the country. I think it is important to look at kind of all of the creative ways that could be used to reduce the number of guns in our country. And I think the Attorney General for his thoughts on what those could be. I think what we are focusing on is the people who are using those guns to hurt each other. There are a lot of guns and we are trying to get rid of them, but it is difficult. But we need to focus our energy too on who is going to use those guns to harm another person, to shoot them, to murder them. And so, I do want to continue to think about creative ways to get rid of the guns, but I do think that we need to also just focus on the people who are going to be committing these crimes and harming others. We're looking at strategic prosecutions and ways that we can use smart prosecutions and focus on the people who are driving the gun violence, the people who have shown that they're willing to take a gun into their hands and shoot another person. And I think that is an important part of it, in addition to just stemming the flow. I think we have to look at all parts of the system.
Can I interject here?
Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I agree with the point just made, but I actually want to pivot back to this conversation about what could be done with respect to the sellers or manufacturers and sellers of guns that get trafficked into the District of Columbia. I think the analogy of New York City to the district is a good one, because New York, most of its guns, again, come from outside not only the city, but outside the state. The city of New York did actually sue gun dealers outside of states when they put together evidence that these dealers were the point source in which the guns were being diverted through negligent or sometimes outright criminal activities by federally licensed gun dealers. They brought lawsuits against 24 gun dealers. I was an expert witness in that litigation and also did follow-up research. We were able to get data for about a dozen of the licensed dealers who were sued and agreed to terms to change their sales practices. And we documented over an 80% reduction in the flow of guns from those dealers back into criminal use in New York City. So I think perhaps with the gathering of trace data and other sources of evidence, you might be able to find particular gun shops in these source states and gather enough evidence to bring lawsuits, again, under this negligence and some of the approaches the Attorney General was mentioning.
Thank you so much. Go ahead.
Just one thing on this. I think it's important to note, but we did say acute solutions and longer terms. And of course, like looking at the longer term way in which we might be able to stem the flow is important, but maybe not for here, but one of the conversations that we can have is what's happening in the gun cases in the district. So in last year, MPD increased arrests for illegal gun possession by 34% to 1,500. So what happens in those cases, right? Like, are there things that there was, I think, both of our prosecutor arms, mentioned that there's challenges with gun possession cases, bringing those forward. Are there things we can do to tighten up those cases? It's not all about, when you hear accountability on our side, we say that a lot. It isn't all about locking people up or otherwise, but what are the interventions or otherwise of those 1,500 people that were arrested for gun possession? Does it just become, well, what's happening there? And so I think that's part of the discussion that maybe we can start to have more is like, are there things that we can do to strengthen on our side, even at the investigatory side, to make it easier to bring gun possession cases? Because the likelihood that if someone possesses a gun that they'll use it right now, it is higher. It is more likely, unfortunately. So I throw that out there as well, because sometimes for our residents, I mean, I'm a really like pragmatic type of person. So like sometimes for our residents, these are complex things that we're talking about. We need to talk about it, but many of us are attorneys here and we're talking in this very sort of complex legal way, which is important. But the practical people want to know what happened to all those people. We arrested them for guns. We know they had guns. We turned in guns. Like, nothing happened. And so again, like this is an ongoing discussion, but what happens in those cases? Is there something we can do to tighten it up? Is there more video that's needed? Is there changes in our laws that are needed? I think that's sometimes like the conversations that we should think about having. And I'm not blaming any of us because we all have our positions, but I think that's what our residents are wanting to hear because they don't understand all the complexities of our legal system. But, you know, maybe there are gaps, maybe there are things that are making it harder. But what they know is someone had a gun, they got picked up off the street, they back out. And we're like, why? And it's not all about holding people necessarily, but what is it? So I just throw that out there because I think we have an opportunity to have the very difficult legal conversations, but we also have to figure out how to have the pragmatic, practical ones that our residents, you know, at community meetings across the city are saying is like, with guns, people are shooting constantly in our neighborhoods. You pick them up, they back out, right? Like, and I won't talk long, but I was in Washington Highlands last week, Anacostia ACC, and it's the same thing. Like people are like, we want to help. We're at the point where we're fed up. But when we help you and people are back here, that puts us at risk. My car got shot up because I helped you. So what are you all doing about that? Because, you know, we got arrested to back out. So I just throw that out there because there's a way in which these conversations can ultimately start to feel like there's no solutions. They're not.
Right.
They're not. These are complex issues. We're not going to solve it, but we can have practical conversations about the roles we each play in tightening up investigations, changing laws if we have to or otherwise.
Well, thank you so much, Deputy Mayor. I think you raise a really good point. And I do just want to recognize that we've been joined by our Ward 7 colleague, Councilmember Vince Gray. Councilmember Gray, if you'd like to say hello, you're welcome to.
Thank you very much, Chairman Pinto. Thank you for calling today's roundtable on gun violence and gun violence prevention. I also want to thank today's witnesses who come forward, those who are participating already, and also those who have joined in the discussion thus far. So violence, specifically gun violence in our neighborhoods, homes, in schools, and roadways are specifically sometimes fatally affect those situations that people are subjected to. It also, as you know, as you've learned already so far, Councilmember Pinto, it also greatly affects their loved ones and communities who also are victims. Those who are passersby, those in the wrong place, the wrong time, and entire blocks, communities that people then are subjected to these situations. I believe we all have heard and felt the concerns expressed by the community, both in our official capacities and as members of their community. I also look forward to the discussion, the continuing discussion of today's efforts, and the emergence with a better, more effective, clearer path forward. So thank you, Councilmember Pinto, for convening this. I'll look forward to continuing with the discussion already. And for those who have joined us from other places, I appreciate your involvement and look forward to working with you. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Councilmember Gray, who's also a member of this committee. So I want to return to the deputy mayor's great point about, and both of our prosecutors' offices mentioned this, that the evidence can be hard to build. So I want to give you both a chance to respond to that. What are some of the gaps in these cases? And are there legislative gaps that we should be filling? Or is there a better partnership with MPD to make sure that the evidence collected is going to help you build a case most successfully? How can we use what we already know to make improvements there?
Thank you, council member, and thank you, deputy mayor. I think when we talk about accountability, I think this community is grappling with what we mean by accountability. And I think that, there is an arrest that can lead to, or there's an offense, whether it leads to an arrest. That's kind of the first measure, whether it leads to charging. And then I think there's questions. Does it lead to pretrial detention? Does it lead to a conviction? Does it lead to a sentence? Does that sentence include jail? Does it include probation? I think these are all questions that the community is kind of grappling with and struggling with what the different measures of accountability should look like at each stage of that. I think it depends, right? And I think that is something that we are certainly working on at each stage. And different accountability looks different for different people and different situations, depending on the seriousness of the conduct. But I did want to kind of talk to, allow my colleague, Ms. Johnston, to talk a little bit more about specific to Superior Court.
Yes, and thank you, Deputy Mayor, for raising that. We hear that as well. And I think as Ms. Suttenberg mentioned, there are several points that someone returns to the community. And the reality is that most individuals that we charge with carrying a pistol without a license are released pre-trial, and DC has a very strong presumption in favor of detention. Favor of release. Thank you. And it's also very unusual for someone convicted of carrying a pistol without a license to receive any period of incarceration. So that person remains in the community, even though we may be prosecuting the case, and even though we may receive the individual may be convicted. But I think there are a number of ways that we can strengthen the cases at the first stage, the cases, whether we charge them or not, which is a partnership with MPD, and the more resources that MPD has to conduct those follow-on investigations so that they have the capability to work on the search warrants with us, which we do every day. And even, as I mentioned, even cases that we don't charge initially, how can we be creative in developing the evidence we need to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt? And I think in this day and age, a lot of it is forensics. A lot of it is search warrants and electronic type of search warrants as well.
Yeah, thank you. I'll add to it that it is important for people to understand the different stages by which a prosecution is made and the discretion that prosecutors acting with integrity have to make along the way. And particularly when you're talking about young people, you're talking about oftentimes many different fact patterns that affect why somebody is possessing a gun. The stories are heartbreaking about young people who are carrying guns because they've been victimized. They're afraid. Sometimes an older person in their home has said, take this gun to protect yourself. Can't tell you how many kids I talk to who say, yeah, I have to sometimes hide a knife or a gun outside school in case I'm going to get jumped on the way home. Not excusing the fact that there's an illegal possession and there's a crime being created, but there's a humanity of a overall circumstance that's occurring too. Forensics is an important piece, and as science gets better and we use technology to be able to build evidence about where guns are and who's actually holding or possessing a gun at a particular time, we have to, as a city, get our Department of Forensic Sciences back online. And can't overstate how much of a harm it is to prosecutors, the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Office of Attorney General, that we don't have an accredited crime lab. So I agree, it's all part of a conversation on brass tacks prosecution, forensic evidence, making prosecutorial decisions on how to handle crimes. When you do get a conviction, whether you get a plea agreement, what are going to be the terms associated with it. We have to talk about our the absence of a prison system that has plenty of space where we can put people when we have these conversations about what are we going to do. Too frequently, there's nobody saying anything about, okay, you know, after we've convicted, what are we doing? Are we warehousing people? And what do we do about the conditions in our prison system and our jails? That has to be part of the conversation when we talk about a holistic approach to it. And then, of course, we have to deal with the other side of the conditions with which a young person feels he or she must have a gun to stay safe. And the trauma that's associated in families that believe that to go to and from school, to be safe, they need to possess a gun. That too is a much larger conversation that goes outside the narrow confines of a prosecutor's office in terms of dealing with the evidence when it's presented to us. I feel like ongoing conversations with MPD and prosecutors' offices about how we build better cases, how we make sure that we are constantly improving and learning from where cases fall apart, where we come up short, is already in the ethos here. I think we've got a community of engaging. I think the fatality review commissions are a good example of that. No finger pointing, no blaming, just case study of what happened. And so the more we can build that into the way in which we interact with one another, we get less finger pointing, we get more joining arms together to try to address this issue.
Thank you all so much. And I'm really interested in this piece that the deputy mayor mentioned about risk, because what continues to be made clear is the legitimization of the police and of prosecutors is important to community safety. And if people don't feel that it's legitimately going to be handled if they intervene or call the police, then we're going to have less safe communities. I'm interested in anybody who has thoughts on this, and this will be my last question before we move on to the next topic around intervention, but particularly interested in your perspective, Ms. Gajwani, about certainty of consequence. And particularly in the context of young offenders, is certainty of being caught or being prosecuted, does the average person have any idea of the length of sentence for a particular crime, or are you finding that they make decisions based off of that? I'd like to hear about what you have found works and doesn't work.
Thank you for that question. I think that gets to the bigger question of deterrence. And if criminal penalties and long sentences and certainty of being detained has a deterrent effect on young people or anybody. And there's actually quite a bit of research on deterrence. And what they find actually is that the deterrent effect is quite low for most of the crimes that we're talking about. Assaultive crimes, homicides, even domestic violence, those kind of crimes, the knowing that you could be detained for, incarcerated, locked up for a long time typically doesn't change behavior, because the thing that sparks that behavior is very emotional. And the largest deterrent effect that you'll find in the research is with economic crimes, because those are very rational crimes. And if somebody knows that they're going to be incarcerated or could be incarcerated, it might deter their behavior. When it comes to young people, the deterrent argument is actually even less effective, because young people don't have good abilities to think beyond, where they are right now. They don't believe that they're going to be caught, right? Young people think that they're never going to be caught. They're never going to hurt somebody even, maybe they have a gun or they have the ability to hurt somebody, but they don't believe they will. And then they find themselves in these situations where something happens either through social media or in a disrespect or in a situation that they didn't anticipate, and all of a sudden things move very quickly. And so the certainty of being caught in those types of situations does not have a great impact. I will say that one thing that's important is to speak to the trauma that Attorney General Schwab talked about. There, young people in the District of Columbia, what we hear from kids that we work with is they believe that everyone out there has a gun, right? Like on social media, They see people with guns. They see the glamorization of the life that has guns. And so they are fearful. Many of the kids who touch the justice system, the juvenile justice system, as Attorney General Schwab mentioned, have themselves experienced violence or have seen somebody that's experienced violence themselves. And that is a traumatic experience. What we don't do a good job of in the city, or really in our country, is addressing the trauma that comes from that. Because if it's unaddressed, what happens is that young people, I think Dr. Richardson can speak way better than I can to this, but young people internalize that sense of insecurity and powerlessness that existed when somebody they loved or knew got hurt. And then they are hypervigilant. Their brains actually change to see danger all around them. And unless you go in and address the trauma that happens when a young person sees domestic violence in their home, when they know that another child was killed or hurt around them, when they see somebody shot, when they know somebody has been shot, unless you address that trauma, they are going to be more likely to use the gun or use violence in the future. And we can prosecute all day long, but if there's going to be this level of violence in our communities and we don't have the infrastructure of therapists and counselors to help young people who are at great risk of that kind of trauma, address that trauma and move on, then we are condemning them to be more likely to get involved in violence themselves.
Okay,
maybe
thank
Dr.
you.
Richard can.
Dr. Richardson, I'm going to come back to you in one moment. I just want to give the deputy mayor a chance to respond from a DYRS perspective, perhaps, and then we're going to move on to interrupting cycles of violence and turn to you.
Sure. I think sometimes people who are accountable on the side of the communities who want to lock everybody up, which isn't the case. We're a part of this system, right? Like DYRS, I was there 9 years. And one of the things that we focused on is, what does love look like, right? We asked that question repeatedly. It was the question that sort of formed the basis of, okay, so what does love look like in public policy? And how do you build that? What would a caring parent do if they were able, right? And so children, you're absolutely right? Like that children require all sorts of love and care and attention. But I think, if we're thinking practically, sometimes when a child does something that's going to harm them, you're like, don't do that again. We do different things to keep them safe. And right now, last year, we had 105 kids shot in the District of Columbia, right? Generally by other young people. So the perpetuation of the cycle of trauma is happening. So we've worked in the district. We're not perfect. We're not. But we're some of the leading in the country. Like when we go around, they're like, we're miles down the road. We recognize we need more mental health supports, but we also have to be real about what's available. We've pumped millions of dollars at DRS. There's a whole host of mental health providers and PsyDs and others who built the program at New Beginnings or throughout the part of the process that is the team decision model, right? Of how we surround kids with support. It's primarily most young people who are committed aren't securely held, right? But there's a cycle of support and love and caring adults who are willing to hold them accountable for the behavior, because that's what loving adults do, but also being there to support and encourage and give resources and care for their family and community. That's the system we built in the district, right? But when we talk about the need for mental health supports, yes. But I think, again, the pragmatic piece is that in our school systems, we've put millions of dollars to have behavioral and mental health supports in schools. We are working to fill those positions. But if you look across the country, there is actually a shortage of mental and behavioral health specialists. So what do we do in the meantime, right? Like it's all parts of the system working together, because we can say we've done a bad job at this, we need these things, but the district actually is putting in all of those resources and trying. So it's all parts of these. On the deterrent effect, we can get into whether or not maximum sentence. There's lots of studies on that, but we also in our statutory provisions remove minimums as well. So there is something to be said just practically for the messages we send when we say we remove minimums and lower maximums, right? But like, what is the deterrent effect? It may not be long sentences, but what we've seen practically is that a lot of old people are using people to commit carjackings and various things, because the juvenile justice system is very different than the adult system. That's a practical thing that's happening in our city right now. So I understand collectively, but in terms of what's happening in the district right now, like we have a host of things going on, and there's nobody here in anywhere that wouldn't say we need to address the trauma, but it's the trauma of everybody. Everybody's being traumatized right now. So what are all the different push points that we can, the levers we can pull to make sure that those who are committing trauma and perpetuating, even in restorative justice models, we recognize that the punishment, the deterrent effect is very separate from the harm that's been caused. You don't restore harm by punishing someone, right? Like that's a whole separate issue of there's been a harm caused to community. Because one of the things that we don't talk about, and I'm just going to say is, who are the victims in our city? They often are the very same people. We don't talk a lot about victims. We just don't, right? So everybody's being traumatized. And how do we do our level best to address all of that? And we hear what our residents are asking for us all the way around. And so these are, again, difficult, like to say we need more mental health. Absolutely. This is a very progressive jurisdiction that believes that, but we can't make what isn't there. So we have to use what we have, all of it, to come together.
So much, Deputy Mayor, and thank you all for your thoughts around this. I'd like to turn now to our work in disrupting cycles of violence and begin by talking about how to best determine which initiatives are a best fit to meet the needs of the district, incorporating some of the staffing challenges that we have. And Dr. Richardson, you currently serve as co-chair of the district's Violence Fatality Review Committee. Can you speak about the work of that committee and how it informs our work to reduce both the incidence of gun violence and violent crime more generally? And I also want to give you a chance to respond to anything you've heard in the last few minutes about what we were talking about with trauma.
Sure, thank you. So before I dive into the CBI work, which I think is critically important, and violence fatality review, I do think we owe a conversation to how those communities are policed, which we have not discussed. And there's community residents who feel that the police are engaged in very egregious acts in terms of recovery, right? And we've heard numerous stories regarding recovery units in the district and the ways that young men and women, as soon as the jump outs approach, lift up their shirts, right? So we also need to think about in terms of how that creates more distrust and more of a feeling of not feeling safe in your communities. And so I think we also need to uplift that conversation as well if we're going to talk about prosecution, what that means in terms of also policing those communities, right? So for the Violence Fatality Review, I think we do an amazing job of bringing together all of the agencies in the district around the table to discuss and analyze cases of young people, primarily young people who have been killed in the DC or are a victim of suicide. One of the things that I think across the board that we've learned in terms of assessing the cases, particularly with young people, one is we see that adverse childhood experience is significant across the board in many of those cases. And so what we find often in terms of upstream risk factors, one would be chronic absenteeism from school. And so why is that so critically important? Well, if you're chronically absent from school, more than likely your reading levels will be low. If your reading levels are low, you increase the likelihood that you'll drop out of school. And we know that on any given day in the United States, almost 70% to 80% of people who may be incarcerated at any given time have dropped out of school, right? So all of these upstream factors are connected. We find that a high number of our decedents are involved in the juvenile justice system. And what does that mean? And I kind of just want to circle even back to the way that we prosecute our cases. When we have young people who are carrying guns, and carrying guns out of fear, violent offender, this is the first time that they've carried a gun. And I have to be quite honest with you. If I were in the same context today as a 15, 16-year-old in Washington, D.C., it would probably be a likelihood that I would carry a gun. Not because of malicious intent or my intent to harm someone, but because of the feeling of being unsafe in my community, the relationships that one has with law enforcement, prosecution, and then all the issues of structural violence that are happening in the community. I rather also, just in terms of kind of framing trauma in the district and what that looks like, just let's think about life expectancy. There was a report which basically found that in the district, you're living in a tale of two cities. In the upper northwest section of Washington, D.C., the life expectancy is 89 years. You travel across the city 15, 20 minutes on Metro, you get off at Congress Heights, your life expectancy is 68. So in a matter of 30 minutes, you lose 20 years of your life. That's not by coincidence. There are structural factors which can contribute to losing 2 decades of life expectancy. And so I think just in terms of like what that means regarding violence and how we talk about violence, violence moves beyond just a gun. Much of the violence we're talking about is structural, right? And then influences gun violence. So for our committee, job, right? There are also some issues around the sharing of data. I'll give you an example of hospital violence intervention programs in the district, which nationally I think is a very well-respected model. We're probably one of the few jurisdictions in the United States where we fully fund our HVIPs. We also have resourced outreach program under the Office of the Attorney General as well as the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement. But the problem becomes when we're conducting our fatality reviews, data from either the HVIPs or from street outreach. So why is that so meaningful? When we're assessing the case of a decedent and looking upstream, we need to know, has that person been injured in the past? Did they show up at a hospital? Did they show up at multiple hospitals at different times? But because we cannot get that information from those organizations, we're unable to make that assessment. We also have no idea of how many times that person has been touched by street outreach. So for example, if our decedent lives in Ward 8 and there's a street outreach team in Ward 8, what is the context of a touch from a violence intervention worker with that person? What did that touch look like? Did they decline services? Were they referred to services? What happened when they went to services? So in the district, I found that, yes, we are very well resourced, but in terms of coordination, right hand typically does not know what the left hand is doing. So you have people that are moving through multiple systems, and we see this in the fatality reviews where we're reviewing a case and we have a decedent who has interacted with at least 10 agencies. And then the agencies may not know if that person was actually touched by another agency in the district. So we found that in terms of the work that we're doing in that space, and I think we need to do like a much better job with regard to how we share data in our reviews. We were talking a little bit offline this morning regarding even social media. One of the things that I think is critical in our analysis in the violence fatality review is for us to understand what someone's social media timeline looked like. And how do we get that data? How do we make sense of what someone's timeline looked up to the point that they were murdered? Right. So in regard to the coordination of data and having the ability to make clear assessments, we're able to do that. And so I give all the credit to our organization, and particularly the people that are leading it for gathering a ton of data, which is very informative to the work that we're doing tremendously. We also have gaps in the level of data that we're collecting as well. And we need to figure that out as a city, how to do that work.
Chair, could I say something in connections to last two comments, which I really appreciate. There's a story, a lot of people have heard it. A lot of people call it the river story, where two people standing on the banks of a river, they hear a child crying, drowning in the river. They run in, grab the child out, resuscitate the child, and then they hear another child drowning and crying in the river. They run in, pull that child out, do the same thing, and they hear yet another one. Well, one of the adults starts walking away. The other says, "Where are you going?" He says, "I'm going upstream to figure out why kids keep falling into the river." And so the notion that I want to challenge Deputy Mayor, that we can't make what isn't there, we have to make what isn't there. When we look at the amount of resources we put into response compared to the resources we put into prevention, it seems, in how long we've been doing this, it seems like we are on a perpetual path of whack-a-mole. If at some point we don't stop and say, you know what, we have to deal with these underlying problems. Yes, they are big, they are complex, but there is no other choice if we're going to stop kids from falling into the river, children from dying in the city. And I think we all want to see the same endpoint, but it seems like there's a hesitation to pause, analyze where we're putting in the resources and what the likely outcome of those resources or more of the same resources are. And I think that's the critical question that's facing us in terms of how we deal with violence prevention going forward compared to how we've dealt with it in the past. And would love to know your thoughts on that.
So just for clarity, I absolutely agree. We do have to address upstream. What I'm saying is that right now, we would love to have all of the mental health providers that are funded, but there's challenges across the board in hiring, right? Like I'm the one who's saying, right, like post-pandemic, this is where we are in many systems: nurses, doctors, police officers, mental health providers, right? Like, so we have funding. You hear it from us. It's not that we don't have the positions funded, it's finding the people to fill them. So what can we do now, right? While we work to build pipelines, those are the discussions we're having, because we have to think differently as a system, because things are different, right? Like the pandemic changed things across the board, and acknowledging that is where we are. When it comes to, there is no hesitancy, right? Like to pause and to take stock. That's exactly what we're doing. Part of what the mayor's process was coming into this term was we have to look at everything differently, because we've been through a lot, right? Just looking over the past 8 years of things we never could have imagined that have changed us, that have changed our systems, without an opportunity oftentimes to pause, particularly in public safety. Like our people never stopped working or going as new things were thrown their way. There's no space to ever just stop and be like, okay, where are we? But that's what we're doing. And that's why it was critical to make sure that we have leaders in place, right? Like the right leaders. But the very discussion that I had yesterday with Director Harley Harper is, let's pause. The very discussion that we had with the mayor, let's pause, right? Because we have to take stock of what's going on, because we put a lot of resources in, but are things going the way we want them to? And sometimes we just have to be honest. And if we're honest in here, we'll say no, right? Because our shooting isn't going down. And that's something that we need, right? Right? Like we need that to happen. And so that's where we are right now, is that pause, is while still having work going, but saying what happened. I mentioned that I'm working with a consultant, Clint Lacey, right? Like that's because we need people a step behind us to say, okay, let's survey this land, because what Dr. Richardson said is correct. We'll sit down. I've been at individual meetings about what's going on in Congress Heights right now, because I was like, I'm hearing lots. And bringing the agencies together, you'll have 4 agencies in the prevention space who are supposedly working with these 6 kids. And you're like, how in the world are you all working with these 6 children? But you didn't talk to each other, right? Like, so it's that kind of grassroots right now. And it is very grassroots in a very large, system that we're doing of the kind of space by space. Is Safe Passage is working, right? We're starting to see, we started this program. We built it relatively large quickly, but wait, we might need to work on the infrastructure, right? Like because of all of our programs, right? Because ONES is 5 years old, and we're seeing some of the places where we wanted to put so many resources in there, but maybe we don't have the infrastructure in place to really make sure that people are clear on what we're asking them to do. Because all prevention isn't the same. All street intervention isn't the same. There's a continuum. We're asking you to mediate. You're not a mediator. You don't know how to mediate crew-based disputes, but we're like, Congress Heights is beefing with 37th, get in there. Well, we never gave you the tools to do it. And you might be someone who works great with young people and a transformative mentoring. You're a credible messenger. But we're saying, oh, you're also this. So we're really looking at that so that what we can come up with is a cogent continuum, right? Because we're stewards not just of our people, but of our people's dollars, right? Like it does matter how we're spending their money because as you all know, based upon the estimates last week, money is not limitless. So we have to be good stewards of public trust all the way around. So there is no hesitancy to take a pause. And a pause doesn't mean we're not going to do this anymore. It just means we have to think about how we're doing it and see what's working, what do we need to work on.
Thank you so much. I want to turn back to Dr. Richardson and address 2 points that you raised, if others have responses to them. One is around the community distrust in certain communities with the police. And I want to ask you, Assistant Chief Parsons, how you're thinking about responding to that feedback, particularly around technically having a no jump out policy, but still hearing from kids that it's happening, and this example of lifting up their shirts. And then afterwards, I want to ask our offices who focus on the street outreach work, how we can fill that gap that Dr. Richardson's talking about with access to data. Is that a privacy issue? Is that a legislative fix? But first to you, Assistant Chief Parsons.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Thank you. So in response to that, I would say that we do not have a gun recovery unit in the district anymore. Our gun recovery unit several years ago was done away with by Chief Conte because he saw the need to build public trust. And it's one thing that the chief believes in is definitely making a partnership with our community. The gun recovery unit was done away with. Our members were retrained and the unit was renamed the Violent Crime Impact Team. So they are more intelligence focused. When they get out of a vehicle, they know exactly who they want to talk to. They're not getting out of a car in a jump out fashion. They are intelligence led. They are getting out of these cars and they are focusing on those individuals in community that are carrying illegal firearms. That would be the first thing I would say about GRU. The second thing I would say is that the chief, as I just said, is very heavily invested in our community to the point where as bureau chiefs, he expects us to hold community events, to bond with the community on a monthly basis, and we do that. The chief also created the Community Focused Patrol Unit, which is from one of the cries in the community, hey, we don't see officers in our community anymore on bicycles. It's a squad of three squads of officers led by officials that deploy to our communities on bikes, and they're not stat driven. They're not out there to make arrests. They're out there to create contacts with the community and let the community know they're there. So there's many different things that the chief has done in his tenure. And it's one thing he definitely believes in is our strong community partnership.
Chairwoman Pinto, you asked about data and particularly with respect to the violence interruption program at the Office of Attorney General. As you know, that's called Cure the Streets. We share all the data that we gather. We have a portal that we put data out. We're sharing data. I'm delighted to say more readily now on the ground with some of the folks in the ONE's office who are meeting. That's anecdotal, but we actually put the numbers out when we can. Some of the information Dr. Richardson referred to as, the healthcare information, we're navigating a federal privacy statute with HIPAA. And it may be that the council has some room to think about privacy and medical data, but right now that's governed by federal statute. So in some this concept of data sharing comes up. I'm surprised how frequently it comes up in the last 60 days of being in this role. We have a confidentiality statute that protects kids in our city. Lots of good reasons why we do that. We have a federal statute that protects health information. There's lots of good reasons why we do that. But we do come across instances where it would be potentially beneficial in the moment to be able to share more information than we can. And I think it's probably for a much longer day, larger conversation as to how much we need to revisit some of these privacy and confidentiality statutes that are out there. So that's where we are on Cure the Streets data.
When it comes to, so maybe you all can hear me. I'm like the project loudly. So it's absolutely true that data sharing is a challenge in the district, right? Like it's not just, it is the federal statutes, but also built within almost every agency are a number of are generally privacy provisions as well as to who you can share with how. And obviously there are practical ways in which agencies overcome that, right? So, I mean, I can speak to DRS. I was the general counsel there for a long time, and you have to be able to share information. You can share aggregate information so long as you're not going to be able to identify a juvenile, right? But as the numbers go smaller, you know, there may be a way to identify. And so even just an example of being able to share educational data, right? We enter it into MOAs and figured out how to do that with healthcare finance and OSSI. There are ways to, it's complicated and it's tough and it takes a lot of time and effort. So I think there would be something to be said for, and we've talked about this in the past, of looking at all of these and cataloging all of these different confidentiality statutes and privacy provisions. DHS has some, right? Obviously the education has FERPA and has FERPA laws, there's HIPAA, there's the actual District of Columbia ones. I think that's something that if we actually took the time to look at, we might be able to figure out, are there legislative changes that could be made to help us share more readily? On the juvenile fatality, I've participated in that multiple times. We found a way to share information, but part of it is who are the district agencies that are present that all of us can share with, right? So it's, you know, there's a provision actually in the statutes that allow us to share with the Child Fatality Review Committee. So in there, you'll have CFSA, DYRS, agencies that generally would not be able to share that information can, because there was a statutory provision that allows us. I think there are things like that that can be done if we visited them, that would make it easier. There's going to be complications when we talk about bringing outside entities in, but right, like public or otherwise, that create a whole new ripple. But there's ways, there's always, where there's a will, there's a way. There just might be statutory or memorandum of agreement or things that have to be entered into. So that's what I would say there. When it comes to the district entities, whether it's ones or otherwise, we can work on whatever the prohibitions are. This is where I talk about infrastructure. And I think in our like zealousness to get to the work, some of the reality is some of the basics of an agency we're really working on. Who are the data people at ones, right? Like, where is the chief operating officer, right? These things where as you grow, ones was almost like a startup, right? And so now there's a need for these things so that we can have the type of robust data sharing and otherwise that would be present in, you know, organizations that are much more matured. And that's where we are, is making sure we have the infrastructure. Because as I've said, from my priority is always transparency with our residents. Things are what they are, right? And we are accountable to them. So we're working on it.
No, I would definitely to have data sharing agreements in place. I think that's really part of the challenge in the work that we do is we're unable to communicate how people are moving through the systems. And just in terms of infrastructure, it's also challenging when we really don't have a uniform way of collecting data. And so what you'll find Cure may be collecting data in terms of let's just log in case notes. And there's a totally different way, a different system that you would find with ones. I mentioned that because we have the DC Peace Academy, which I've led the first cohort of training for the VIs, and that was part of the challenge with the training, how we collect data. And so the system has a different way of collecting data in the district. That can also be very challenging because there's no standardization in terms of if you're collecting data differently, it's housed so differently. How do you actually make the assessment in terms of analyzing the data is collected in a different way? So there are other challenges too in terms of infrastructure where we're also documenting things in the district.
One of the things that former Director Lacey, our Director alumnus, Lacey is working on is what are the shared agreements we have to make no matter who's running programs, right? Because like we do have sort of a lot of streams, HVIP, safe passages, cure, ones, credible messengers, right? Like even roving leaders, all who are kind of part of that continuum. And we are working on looking at everyone's going to have their different models, and that might be something we really need to think about. But even what are the shared agreements we can come to together of what we're tracking? Because there are some things we have to. Other people may have programmatic things they need, but what are the basics that we need to be able to track to say we're a system, not an agency, not a program that is functioning at whatever level it is. And so that's part of the work that we're doing to say, what are the things we must, and where can we get everybody from, Peace for DC to our partners at Cure to all of our agencies to agree on. We're working on it.
Thank you all for that. I think that's really helpful. And I'll just say, from my perspective, I think that the privacy and confidentiality pieces that are so important for our young people are really important to maintain. And I hope that we can do that work together, to whether it's looking at data on aggregate or figuring out how we can just keep data internal to the government agencies that are touching these young people, similar to the way we do record sealing, where no one from the public can access that data, but our law enforcement entities can access it. A similar model might make sense here. And so I look forward to working on that with our partners. Dr. OBrien, I want to ask you to speak a little bit about your work in standing up the Milwaukee Homicide Review Commission and what in particular led to the success of that commission. I believe one study credited the commission with reducing homicide rates in targeted communities by over 50%. And if you have any lessons shared from Milwaukee that we could bring to the district.
Absolutely. So just a couple of things for the last conversation, I think that might be important to think about. I can share, we worked for the overdose fatality reviews, which I know is different, but there are some documents that we have put out at the national level about information sharing that I think are relevant, because it does include protected health information and juvenile information. The second thing I think that could be considered is thinking about more of a bifurcated review process. I know that there were concerns about information sharing within groups. So thinking about how you can pull the groups that can share information together to have those conversations, and then think about how you could have a second review where sensitive information may not be shared, but you could still have really in-depth conversations. So taking a step back to your question, in thinking about the success that we had in Milwaukee, it was really, I think what we created through that process was an opportunity for people to share information in a really trusted environment. And you had the right people in the room that could share information, and you had the right people in the room to think through what were new strategies we should be thinking about. And then you had a structure in place. So it wasn't just a review or a series of reviews. You actually had an executive leadership team that was able to hear and see the aggregate level data from multiple partners, that the case findings were available to the executive leadership team. And then finally, the recommendations that were coming out of the case reviews were presented to the executive leadership team. And then you were able to make progress. And then this was done in an ongoing way. And you're always going back and looking at your data to see where you're having success and where you may need to tweak those recommendations. And so when I think about why were we successful, we were successful because I think we created this trusted environment. We were using data as real time as possible. So at the time, we actually had an individual that was looking at the homicides every morning, and then the non-fatal shootings every morning. And so we had a really robust data system that was up to date. And we were able to use that to really look at where our strategies were working or weren't working. We created this trust that I mentioned, and you had the opportunity, I think, for agencies to really figure out how they could work better together, and created an environment where there was no dumb idea. There was no finger pointing. It was, how can we work better together? And that was something that was not only within the government agencies, but was also part of our community service provider reviews, where information from the criminal justice reviews were shared with the community, and they could share what they knew about the neighborhoods, what they knew about the individuals, and how together new recommendations could be crafted. And some of the recommendations that were created were pretty simple. It was changing standard operating procedure, or it was thinking about how one agency could share information with another agency so that people could be more informed as to where they should be putting their attentions. Some of it was legislative at the city level, as well as the county and at the state. So some of the recommendations, I think it's important to note, were easily accomplished with making 1 or 2 phone calls. Others took time, took years even, to implement the recommendations. But I think one of the things that I saw that was so valuable was, once individuals saw that this process worked, they applied it to other things. So we created a domestic violence homicide review process. We created a juvenile justice process where we just focused on kids and young people. And for that, we were able to get a court order from the presiding judge at Children's Court to allow all of the players to share information to really understand where were those missed opportunities. And then ultimately, as was already described, we applied it to overdose. But within the city of Milwaukee, others saw the value, and they would take the same kind of model of, let's bring the right people to the table, let's look at aggregate level data, and then dive into some cases to understand what we can all do better. So I think those are some of the successes, why we were successful, because we had buy-in, we had the right people, we had really robust information sharing. And then we had a way to, a structure in place for implementing the recommendations that were developed through the process.
Thank you so much, Dr. O'Brien. One of the things that kind of strikes me in hearing about this is the importance of having a shared goal. Each of us has kind of different roles to play here, but I believe our goal is to save lives. And if we could have come at this review and analysis from that perspective, then hopefully some of the recommendations can be impactful. Thank you. So we have an inevitability coming to the district in the expiration of some of our ARPA dollars. And we've talked a little bit about the importance of data sharing and why we need to make some improvements there, I think, to get folks doing the intervention work access to this data so that our interventions can be more effective. But after we do that, what should we be assessing? And as we are evaluating our choices, because some choices may need to be made about where the most effective dollars are going in our intervention efforts. Once we get that data, what type of things should we be evaluating? Dr. Webster, go ahead if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, so as you noted, Dr. Richardson and I recently were funded by Arnold Ventures to conduct research to shed light on the impact of community violence intervention programs in the district, and we're just getting started and eager to get that moving forward. We were very intentional in how we've set this up. Certainly, we're going to do very rigorous analytics to ascertain the, as close as we can, a causal connection between the programs and any outcomes connected to violence. But we're also going to be collecting data from the frontline workers that really we hope will inform really the structure and how these programs work. And more opportunities, I suspect, will emerge because I don't think we're going to see the current CVI programs sort of in a status quo situation, operating exactly as they are now next year or the year after. Or what I expect and hope is that there will be innovation within the space. We've been talking about sharing data. One of the things I really want to underscore, getting back to this sort of fundamental idea of a public health approach and having your approach be data driven. One weakness of the way community violence is intervention programs are often implemented in cities is that they carve out very specific boundaries for the workers within a particular neighborhood. But of course, the violence within that occurs is not wholly between people who live in that neighborhood. A lot of the disputes and violence goes across these boundaries. So what I think we need to really examine is how well are the current programs sharing information so that they can mediate disputes that cut across these boundaries, and evaluating sort of how any adaptations that occur. One thing that the ONE's office has done that we're very eager to examine, that I think is unique, is that in addition to having CVI programs carved out within very specific neighborhoods, they also have some of the workers who are more flexible to respond as conflicts emerge that are believed to be, potentially risky for future gun violence. So we're eager to learn more about that, come up with new methods for estimating program impact. The other thing I'll just note in the way we're currently designing our study is we want to hear from the CVI workers as well as the participants that they're engaged with, the degree to which they're connected to the other relevant programs and what they're getting from them. So that's sort of how we're approaching the project right now. But again, my expectation is that, and my hope is that there will be innovations, and we need to be able to collect relevant data so we learn as we go. The field has been too stagnant. I'm really hopeful that the district is eager to not just stick with the same old approach, but to always look for how programs are strengthened.
Specifically on age groups, we are asking how they engage with age groups, because what we also find too is there's a lack of coordination and information sharing between age groups as well as through outreach. So, for example, and I just said this is from my own experiences in the context of before discharge, charge. This person is thinking about retaliation. That site to what's happening in the situation, continuation of retaliation occurring. So we really need to understand what the level of communication is between the HVACs where someone's been treated at the trauma center and what happens after discharge, because in these cases retaliation will continue. So we need to have some terms on what that looks like. One thing I do want to mention, just to follow up on the deputy mayor's point regarding services, I think in context what that looks like for HVIP. Typically, our HVIP licensed clinical counselor. At the step of the streets, we had 746 people coming in a year. Those cases to start with, this person's second recent case in Washington, D.C. shot 4 times, and the person was killed. I think it's been more publicized. That's the kind of person that we need to think about training. To 75 people that fall into that category. Staff. Specialists was a person have your licensed clinical counselor. So we're talking about 746 people to them to determine that 745 decide to treat. So just in terms of, I want people to get an understanding of what it looks like in that space, because we're doing a coming downstream staff. That's also been affected by COVID. HVIP's lost a significant number of their staff. So just to put in context, in terms of the mental services we're offering, in terms of what we can offer people coming to the trauma center and affected, not just by the injury, the trauma that's occurred in their life course. Right. And so that's what it looks like from the perspective within an HVIP. Not to also, and I don't want to harp on this point, but I also want to make people very aware that we have a lot of egregious practices that happen between law enforcement and patients in a clinical space. There's a national conversation around that occurring right now. We have officers that confiscate possessions. Authorization to third parties. We have interrogations that are happening. Someone's coming to multiple shots. Someone's coming with the clothes. Surgery. Officers interrogations in that space. Without the presence of a certain issues that have recently published conferences, and I would also like to uplift and encourage them to engage in that conversation as well, because there is the intersection of enforcement and clinical spaces that we're not addressing.
Thank you so much for raising that, Dr. Richardson. And Deputy Mayor, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, but I do want to keep us moving to the next portion of our discussion around youth, so we can definitely continue this conversation. I do want to just lift up some of the ideas shared from the last several days of public witnesses around some of our violence interruption work and the repeated calls for training, pay, and mental health supports for our VI workers who are doing such important and sometimes traumatic work. So let's turn to our youth. We know that exposure to gun violence has a lasting, significant impact on the well-being of our young people.
And young persons living in communities with high rates of gun violence face significant trauma, and that trauma affects their mental and physical health and their ability to learn. Deputy Mayor, can you speak to the programs the district has stood up to address this critical issue? Ending gun violence is not just enough, but we need to ensure that we're providing those harmed by gun violence with the supports they need to break the cycle that we've talked about today.
Sure. I mean, certainly making sure that we're taking care of those who are the victims of gun violence is deeply important. I mean, there's when it comes to juveniles, right, like so much of their life is lived at school. So I do want to uplift, right, like all the work that we're doing between DMPSJ and DME to make sure that there are services and supports for young people at school, right? Because there is a lot going on there, whether it's one's leadership academy or just or safe passages or just generally the expansion of mental health supports for young people at school, which by and large is we want them in school, is a significant focus for us. In the district, right, like the Office of Victim Services and Justice grants about $100 million to community-based organizations that are providing services and supports to victims kind of across the spectrum, right? Like from domestic violence to sexual assault to children as victims to, and kind of like the whole universe, including the HVIPs. One of the programs that they provide just generally that we know we need to work on is the crime victim hotline to try and create a centralized place and a hub for many victims of any crime in the district to be able to access our network, because as wonderful it is that we have so many services and supports, it can be very overwhelming, right? To know where you're supposed to go for what. And so it's been a work in progress for us to create a no wrong door, whether it's through CFSA Family First Centers, right? Like wherever you come in, we're going to try to make sure that there's the supports for individuals. The other thing too is family support services through ONES, which we could, with the amount of victims of pure gun violence, which we have upwards of 900 people shot in a year in the district, right? Like that's a significant amount of need just in that one space. And so we have work to do there, right? I named a few of the specific programs, but like I said, it's kind of a circle of who's victim. I mean, I think in our city, so many people are being victimized now that we could kind of go across cluster and look at ARPA investments in specific programs, like there was mental health services put at ONES, and then a youth mental health service stood up through ARPA dollars. We're making a lot of investments kind of across the system, the CRT, but the relative kind of explosion in the need for mental health services is something that we're grappling with. How do we how do we have enough supports for the level of need, which has always been high, but is exponentially higher at this point. So I think in the district, we grapple with the same challenges that Dr. Richardson mentioned kind of across the board. Is the weight of need sometimes is well outpaces what we have as available resources. And so we're working on ensuring that embedded within our agencies and not just ARPA is the ability to have the training to provide, even at a base level, some of the types of mental health supports that our host of victims need.
So I could talk for a long time about how we're trying to uplift kids and protect kids and try to get to a place where all of the kids in our city, no matter where they live, are living independently, productive, hopeful lives. I firmly believe that kids who have hopeful futures and are hopeful about where they are in life are safer to themselves and everybody around them. And there's so much that we're doing. But let me highlight a couple things, and then I want to ask Ms. Gajwani to talk a little bit more about restorative justice, which is something we're very proud of. But so at the AG's office, we're trying to think everywhere we have lawyers or professionals that are touching kids' lives, how do we make sure we're all aligned and we don't have silos within the Office of Attorney General? So we talk about child support and making sure that kids who are in families where custodial and non-custodial parent may not be together anymore, but they both hopefully are going to contribute to their children living lives that are hopeful, and that the financial friction doesn't create more trauma for the kids in the house. We are working with Child and Family Services when kids have to be removed from a home. That is a very traumatic event. So how do we try to ameliorate situations where there's a situation where arguably kids are in unsafe places? Oftentimes, we know that kids being kids, they get into disagreements with their parents. Oftentimes police are called. There's violence from a teenager to a parent or a grandparent. Police are called, temperatures are hot. And to try to avoid criminalizing that, because it's a 24 or 48 hours, temperatures will cool down. Oftentimes we'll see a parent or guardian say, I want my kid prosecuted at the moment. And a couple hours later, they're like, we really don't. So we have a innovative partnership with Sasha Bruce and MPD that we're innovating to try to see if we can find a time to cool down and keep kids from getting into the criminal system with a safe place. They can get a meal, get a shower, safe place to sleep, and let temperatures cool down. We're working hard on truancy. We've got a pilot program, which we call Attend, working at several elementary schools and middle school up until 6th grade in Ward 7 and 8, really trying to see if we can't help parents rather than criminalizing parents or prosecuting parents when kids are supposed to be at school, or criminalizing kids when they're old enough to supposed to get themselves to school. Can we start to get to some of what are the real reasons why kids aren't showing up at school? And we're starting to see some good promise in improving on the truancy. We have, when we're in a traditional prosecutorial role, diversion programs where we're looking to see, are there opportunities to get kids services, the support they need, cognitive behavioral therapy or other mental support before they get into the system. Sometimes we're also doing deferred prosecution or deferred disposition agreements where children have a chance to get the resources and to prove they can stay on track during that critical period where they're most likely to get rearrested or to reoffend. Can they get through that 6 or 9 month period where they're staying on track through a deferred disposition agreement? So we're trying to bring traditional prosecutorial tools as well as an expanded, broader view on how we protect kids. Obviously, you know a lot about the work we're doing in housing, and housing seems the instability of housing for any family, but for kids in particular, is something we see repeatedly as being a risk factor. So if we can work on terrible housing conditions in our city, making sure the housing stock in our city, that our housing authority are all doing the work they need to do to make sure people have safe, warm places to live, that too, we think is helping kids. So, but let me turn it over to Ms. Gajwani to talk a little bit about restorative justice and what we're seeing there.
Thank you. As Attorney General Schwab mentioned, our prosecutorial function is one that is very much focused on public safety. We have people in our office who are constantly collecting and analyzing data on issues that are presenting themselves over the last few years. We've been really carefully tracking carjacking issues, gun matters. And so we're really focused using data and analysis on where to put our resources. And we have a whole line of prosecutors who, are going to trial every day. In certain circumstances, they're asking for young people to be detained as necessary. But what we also know is that when we lock up a child, there is a cost to that. And incarcerating children alone is not going to actually lead us long-term to safety. And we really need to rethink what our goal is in the juvenile justice system in particular, and it should be oriented towards the best strategy to change behavior, especially of young people and because they're children. Extensive research shows that when you lock up a young person compared to a similarly situated young person who is given services and moved out of the system, that person who is locked up, that child who's locked up, is going to be less likely to complete high school. They are going to be less likely to be able to get a job later on, and they're going to be more likely to develop mental health issues, be incarcerated again, even in the adult system. And so there is a cost to just incarcerating all of our kids. We have to really focus on what is going to change their behavior. And that's where restorative justice comes in, and the reason that the Office of the Attorney General started a restorative justice program is because we know that the foundation to behavior change is taking responsibility for what you've done and building empathy and consequential thinking. And this is absolutely true for juveniles. In fact, it's also studies have shown effective for adults as well. But certainly if we're focusing on young people, what restorative justice does is it has them, take responsibility, acknowledge what they've done, speak directly to the person that they've hurt, hear from them about how badly they've hurt. And what happens is that they build empathy. They realize the consequences of their behavior. And then they have to work with the victim of the crime and their family members and their supporters to figure out what they're going to need to do so that this never happens again. And that's just very different from our justice system. Our justice system, our trial process is like really well calibrated when somebody wants to go to trial and contest their guilt. But 95% of cases on the juvenile and adult side end in pleas. Right. But when you take a plea, especially for a young person, you never have to say sorry to anybody. You very rarely hear directly from the victim. You don't have to answer their questions, and you don't have to do things for them to make it right, which is how you build the instinct to change your behavior. And where you use restorative justice, what you find is that kids do change their behavior compared to those who go through the justice system. And it works also on adults. And that's what we're looking for. We need them to think differently because as Councilmember White said, the problems of today aren't going to be solved by the things that we've done in the past, which is a little bit more like whack-a-mole. And so we really need to focus on what they need. And it's not really a coincidence that the young people who are in our justice system, the ones who touch our justice system, that means from arrest to getting incarcerated, are also the ones that are struggling with significantly higher rates of homelessness, higher rates of foster care. That means they've experienced abandonment at a very, very young age, abuse and neglect. This is what our CJCC report on the root causes of juvenile involvement showed, that there's a significantly higher rate of being involved in the juvenile justice system if you've got these issues: homelessness, child abuse and neglect, foster care, extreme poverty, mental health issues that have not been addressed, and significant education deficits. So what we know then is that if we want to change behavior for those kids who are in the justice system, when we have the responsibility to do that as the prosecutor of kids who are touching the justice system, we have to focus on building their empathy and consequential thinking. And we also have to give them the services and the treatment and supports that they need to thrive. Because all teenagers make bad decisions. I made bad decisions. We all made bad decisions. I have teenagers myself. They're stupid, but the ones who are engaged in the really dangerous behavior happen to be the ones who are struggling in other aspects of their lives. And that's why our restorative justice program doesn't just focus on accountability and acknowledging harm and working with victims and building empathy, but also providing those kids with cognitive behavioral therapy, which research shows is the most effective way to change behavior. And those two things coupled are showing us that the kids who go through the restorative justice program are changing their behavior. They have less recidivism than kids in the other processes.
I want to zoom into this issue around the family that some of you have touched on, and family supports, especially when we're seeing the trauma associated with some of these crimes for our young people. How can we reach the family and the parents to get them what they need to help ensure that their children are on a successful and productive and hopeful path? And we have some folks in the room today who testified about this over the weekend and shared their really powerful personal stories about the efforts they have engaged with as parents and grandparents in trying to support their kids in a system that was seemingly hopeless in an environment where more resources needed to reach them. So how can we get those families what they need?
Yeah, so ultimately, young people are a part of a family and a community, right? So there's no supplanting that, right? There's not, whether they're involved in DYRS or any other part of the system, they're still part of a family, right? And no matter where you are in the system, young people or juveniles or older, they're part of a community. And so even more so with young people, right? It's important to uplift the needs of the family. I see Mama Joe, right? It's deeply important to make sure that parents are a part of the process because our young people, we want them at home. There's no question that ultimately the goal for all of us wherever a young person finds themselves in the system, is to be at home if that's a safe place for them to be. And if not, to help get the family to the point where that is a safe space. Or if it never becomes a safe space, still maintain relationship, right? Because that's ultimately part of it. It's complex, it's challenging, right? Because the holistic needs of a family, like what got a young person to the point where they may use a gun or otherwise. I think last night we had a 14-year-old shot at 2:30 in the morning, right? He was out, he was shot 3 times. Okay, so he's 14, which means that we can address what happened there, but we're also going to have to figure out what is going on at home, because for a young person to be out at 2:30 in the morning to get shot 3 times on a early Monday morning, there's things going on. And so the coordination piece is key. Like I keep saying we're kind of grassroots right now. Like in November, the mayor called not all, but like a number of the key child serving agency heads together, right? Like on public safety, education, CFSA, to sit down and say, our young people are not doing well. They're being shot and their behavior isn't what we want. She's like, but it's not their fault. So what are we going to do, right? And that involves, we talked about how many parents show up at the YSC or MPD to be like, my kid is in trouble, take them, right? And we don't have any mechanisms really there to engage because there's no neglect issue necessarily, and they're not in the juvenile justice system. So we have this gap of trying to figure out how do we provide the type of intensive services that we provide to a young person who's committed, because that's really where the district for a young person in crisis is involved, right? Is once they're committed. And so that's the discussion we're having, because some of it is we can support the families, and we must support and listen to what families need and provide those. And then also sometimes the families need a respite, right? Because they're so overwrought with what's going on with this one young person. If you look at a number of the kids shot last year, many of them 6 siblings, 5 siblings, parents working hard, right? Like a lot going on in the home. So how do we provide that? Well, these are challenges, right? Like, how do we do that without a young person being required to participate in something? Because a lot of times you said teenagers don't want to do things. They're not going to do mental health services just because we say, right? So we don't have a mechanism without commitment, but fine. What the district is doing, we literally built a critical response protocol. A young person has been shot, there's been a stabbing, or there's an incident within 1,000 feet of a school. We started a text message chain of all of the principals. Who knows this young person? Somebody knows this young person, right? It sounds like hyper simplistic for a government of our size, but it's worked, right? Because what it's become is a model for, oh, CFSA touched that young person, but they wouldn't even know. Oh, the schools always know the young people, right? So then it's like, well, what does the family need? Because CFSA is now involved. So it's that we're in that process of how do we kind of strip back to the basics of how we engage, right? Like in a system that's very large, to rebuild in a bit of how we communicate with each other. So that's happening. And I will say this, that process started in November, and we have not had a retaliatory shooting since that happened of young people, because it takes that kind of intensive, like, now we go to work. What does the family need? How do we stay in there with them? What does this young person need? They're not in school. We need to drive them to school, right? It's been that kind of a process. So that's just kind of an example of what we're trying to do to really get in and address what are very holistic and complex needs and in any single one family or behavior by a young person.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Dr. Richardson.
So in the age-fib space, what we have found are families who are suffering from vicarious and secondary trauma. One of the focus groups that I conducted with was even the girlfriends and wives of to a space where they've totally changed psychologically, trauma, injury. Caregivers have an idea of how to deal with that person, because we don't do a good job in the space of telling a caregiver, this is what you should expect. This person is coming back into your house, into your home. Suffer from hyperarousal, depression, nightmares. Also, we have to deal with secondary trauma. charge of example. Yeah, as a trauma recidivist, I can so I have to think about so this person potentially be something calling to say loved one has been injured again, unfortunately murdered. So in space, we try to provide caregiving caregivers with support services, but that's not uniform across all HFIBs. So I would also encourage that we make more investment in that. So the caregivers are do support services when someone's returning back to the home. Just in terms of fatality reviews, particularly Chief Parsons talks about this a lot. Conflict resolution. Discuss that today. To address that at a very early age, to incorporate that into our educational curriculum, because what we find in most of the majority of the cases that we review, so disputes, it's from 100 very quickly to either one person or two people that have a brain to emotional intelligence, and we have a homicide on our hands. So how do we get to young people to engage in conflict resolution very early on? That just becomes part of socialization. And so the two things that you mentioned, which I think we can close to in terms of intervention specialists, when you mentioned the pay. Tap into that. Intervention specialists have the most difficult job of anyone that I know that does work in this space. So $45,000 to me, it's just totally a slap in the face in terms of the respect and value for their work. So to professionalize their work in ways that they're out in the community engaging in work that's very dangerous. And I'm not sure if just in the context as that we can with the past years. So just the context is very difficult, it's very challenging in terms of services. Do a good job, we might have to determine to judge whether we do a good job or not with providing services for the community. Workers, but it's definitely needed to respect to treat them as professionals. With just in terms of resources, DC this initiative as well have initiative district, which is a concern on universities, colleges in the district have decided to combine using resources to tap into those universities ready to kind of force their hand down more skin in the game. So we have George Washington, Georgetown, actually utilize and tap into those universities, provide some of the resources that we're talking about today. Schools have schools of social work, have departments of psychology, schools of public health, intellectual capital, as well as resources in communities to be quite frankly, specifically close proximity, universities never step foot on their campuses. So I think it's important that we all say that we have this initiative. It's like we begin to engage in those conversations about what ways can provide the resources to complement the programs that we're discussing here today, just in terms of how we train guys in CBT, how we train residents, because at this point, to just create a pipeline of mental professionals overnight. So we have to think about creative ways to train communities to engage in CBT. How do we train them to be certified first aid? So the process really needs to be much more ground up. Is critical to this conversation.
Thank you so much. A lot of really important ideas there. I want to just ask about one final kind of particular issue, and then we'll move on to our last section of today to talk about interagency coordination and rearrest and rehabilitation. So we have heard from Chief Conte and others about this continuing problem of lyrics being placed online and YouTube and Facebook, frankly, encouraging violence that we can see and kind of track to some of these homicides and particularly retaliatory incidents. Is there any way that we can be thinking of handling this differently? Of course, other countries don't have our First Amendment protections to the same extent, but I think London has done some efforts to remove these videos. Any ways we can be working with these private companies and leaning on them to remove these videos? I'm not sure if you all have perspective on this or anybody of how we can better intervene when we see videos encouraging violence, getting those removed and getting to those young people primarily, but participants as fast as possible.
I'll go ahead and jump in.
Sure,
first.
thank you.
So we have, of course, seen the same thing. And when we recognize that, there's a few things that we do right away. Right away, we internally disseminate that information. Hey, this group put out a video referencing this group. There could be a problem, could be violence. And we do the best we can to fill the gaps in any neighborhoods, to provide those special attentions, provide that police presence. We also look at the folks involved too, to see what are their conditions of release. Are they under anybody's supervision? Hey, C. Sosa, this is your person. They're dancing around with other people with guns. They're doing it. So we try to make sure all of our partners are aware of that. We share that information with the ONE's office. There has been occasions where we have reached out to different platforms to try to get videos taken down. I'm not too familiar with the process. I think we've been successful once or twice, but I can't recall, DM. I don't know if you remember if it was us reaching out or through the ONE's office reaching out. Yeah.
We tried both. And I mean, even if we were successful, let's say with getting something removed from YouTube, the challenge these days is TikTok, right? Like, is that there's an immediacy, right? By the time it takes to get something down, young people have been on TikTok and have shared information and right, like very quickly, the others see it and are able to challenge that. So certainly a challenging space because as social media gets faster, you know, it's very hard to get ahead of it. And so what the chief is saying is real is making sure to intervene and certainly making sure we're not like encouraging in those spaces, right? Because certainly some of our young people that we know or others that we know or who are known to us intervening, right? Like when we see that, but it's a challenge. I mean, it's like one of those sort of like new world challenges of something can be up in TikTok like that. And people have already now challenged each other and arranged a spot to meet up and to brawl. So the chief is right that we have tried through ONE's and through MPD, but the platforms are not necessarily that amenable to like removing things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, it's certainly something I would really like to work with everybody at this table on. As somebody pointed out, the recent youth hearing that we had with Councilmember Trayon White, they said people were taking down videos with COVID misinformation, which was helpful to advancing the public health. And I think a similar argument can be made here when they're particularly violent. Okay, let's move on to our final topic of today, which is strategic interagency planning and coordination. And I want to start with a conversation around recidivism and coordination. A 2021 study by the National Institute for Criminal Justice Reform found that victims and suspects of homicides have been arrested on average 11 times for about 13 different offenses by the time of the homicide. The study also estimated that at any one time, there are likely no more than 200 individuals responsible for 60 to 70% of all gun violence in the district. Author and gun violence reduction expert Thomas App describes these individuals as hot people. That is, people around whom the majority of lethal violence is centered. How do you think we define productively a hot person in the district, and do different agencies work off the same list of people? And how can we more effectively intervene when these individuals are identified?
As part of NIJCR process of working with us, we identified, I think it was part of that same study, David Muhammad identified some of the characteristics of who hot people would be in the district. Not unusual to us, right? Like nothing that was necessarily earth shattering when it comes to, working off a same list. I think that certainly Metropolitan Police Department works together with federal partners, including CSOSA and PSA, to identify those who are known to the system. One of the things is any lists that exist at any point in time could be stale by the next day, right? Because like who is hot on one day, on any given day can really shift. And so one of the things that we're working on more than hot people is working with those who know community, right? Because that's part of it, is the people who know community know who might be hot any given day, right? Like we could look at number of arrests and all of those things, and that's certainly something the law enforcement space does. But in the violence intervention space, this is why it's important to have people with roots in community and relationship to say at any given point in time, this may be something that's kicking off. This person is on edge or otherwise. So there's no, like to say we have like this ongoing list that everyone works off of. No, but one of the things that one of the things that we certainly do is, or trying to do is work with our partners, right? To bring in HVIP. ONES has now started a convening with CURE, a weekly convening with CURE, HVIP, Credible Messengers, CSSD is there, like all of our partners to say, hey, this is who was involved in shooting this week, because the Metropolitan Police Department does provide us on a daily basis. I'm pointing to Chief Parsons because it is him. This is who was shot yesterday, right? To see like, is there some linkage here? Is there a history? Do we know who this individual is? Who do they associate with? So it's more of that kind of coordination on a very, very grassroots level, and also having the type of community connections because our community does want to help and say, hey, this could be a problem. That I think is more of how we form who is a hot person.
I think that this is ultimately the most important thing that might come out of your roundtable today and the work you're doing, which is our government knows through the various ways in which we touch people's lives who is likely more at risk than others. And we know in our office, at the Office of Attorney General, that there are different times we touch kids' lives from different perspectives. And I've tasked and challenged all of us in the Office of Attorney General to see how we all can play a part in trying to communicate around when we see something that gives us a concern about the safety of a young person or their family, something that's creating a particular insecurity or stressor, and try to be proactive about that. I think that question of coordination, and Dr. Richardson talked about it earlier, about the way in which people move through the system at different times and touch different parts of our system. We've created the impediments and blockages to actually figuring out how to talk about it and share that in real time. Smart government should be able to figure out how to mitigate that. It's easy to be siloed. It's easy for people to put blinders on and say, all I need to do is what's right in front of me. And I think it's an all of government challenge to us, is how do we break down the silos that happen? We have organizational silos that happen just by nature of being a complex organization. We also have political silos that happen because there's a politics that happens in our city and in communities everywhere, which get in the way of doing our job, which is to protect the people who are counting on us to figure out ways to make the city safer. So I actually think that question of how do we effectively share information so we do know the hot list, whatever we call it, are the people who are at greatest risk right now for us to get to them and to triage limited resources to help, to mitigate. And I think we're seeing that in small parts. I think some of the violence interruption work, the model of it is to identify that and surge people to where they need it most. But we obviously, all of us can do a much better job in figuring out how we share that information. And I think that's, that is the $64 question.
One thing we did too, just, in the juvenile spaces, our schools have so much information, but oftentimes the mayor convened a meeting of principals of middle schools and high schools, both charter and public, in January. And one of the things is they know who their young people are, who they're afraid are at risk of gun violence, but they don't know where to go. Where's that point? Who should they tell that to? And so, our office just created like a single place people can tell that to while we build out a system, right, of where these things should go, because that's kind of the thing is like, information, but where does it go to? And then what? And so as the deputy mayor's office, it is our responsibility at this point to be the hub of the wheel while we build out, right, like a robust system. So I put that out there too, because that's part of it is like, where's that one place we can go? So we're trying to create those like single places because it's also important for accountability. Who's responsible?
Okay, well, thank you all for that. And as it gets warmer and warmer, unusually warm lately, and head into the spring and summer months when we see incidents of violence rise across ages and categories. What can we do to use the lessons that we've learned from years past? And I want to ask you all this as well around the cases that you've seen in the past. Are there other contextual clues that we can use from previous prosecutions to help inform our intervention efforts earlier so we don't see these spikes this summer?
Well, I did want to echo some of the other thoughts here that we are using, working on using a data-driven approach to identifying the dangerous people in our community and removing them from the community when it is appropriate to do so, when they've committed a criminal offense for which they can be prosecuted. And when we are able to arrest and prosecute the people who are most driving the violence, we do see reductions in the community violence in those communities. And I think that can be one of various methods to prevent violence. I think as we're looking for, what our prosecution should entail, we're looking certainly to individuals and their criminal histories. What have they been arrested for? What have they been charged for? When we're kind of looking at who are the people who should be prosecuted by our office, we are kind of relying on broader picture considerations as well, and where the violence has been identified, and where we can most proactively target our prosecutions to reduce the level of violence in the community. Sometimes that's through prosecution. Sometimes it's through holding people in jail. And that is an important part of this. Sometimes people do need to be removed from the community, whether it be in a pretrial sense or through sentencing, in order to reduce community violence, because we are concerned that they are going to perpetrate that violence again. And so we look at a holistic set of factors when we're kind of assessing where our prosecutorial resources are best invested, and where the court and the community's expectations can be met.
But can I just ask you about this, because you mentioned it earlier, your colleague mentioned earlier, the strong presumption of release for all ages. When it comes to adults, is there a specific statute that suggests that you're referring to?
Sure. That is in our Title 23 of the DC Code, and specifically chapters, I think 1321 to 1329 are pretty much the adult pretrial detention statutes. There are a few crimes that have a slightly different set of analyses: first and second degree murder and assault with intent to kill while armed. But for every other offense that we're looking at, there is a presumption of release before trial. There are a few kind of critical points that we're looking at when we're talking about pretrial detention. First is when they come in for initial presentment or arraignment, and whether they're detained at that point. There are certain statutes that apply at that point where the government can request a hold in limited circumstances, particularly where they've committed a crime of violence, a dangerous crime, or a crime while on release, either pretrial pending sentencing or probation. But unless there is a specific statutory unless there's a specific statute, we cannot request that a person be detained pre-trial. So that is the presumption that we're talking about. But then once we also get to the detention hearing, which takes place either a few days later to more days later, depending on the basis for the hold, and I know I'm kind of getting a little bit in the weeds here, then there is a slightly different analysis that applies in terms of whether that person will be detained pending trial. And there are certain presumptions that the court looks at in limited cases, but unless there is that rebuttable presumption of detention for those limited circumstances, there is a presumption that that person will be on release pre-trial. And just last caveat is that there can be changes of circumstances if they commit a new crime, if they're in violation of their pretrial release conditions or other situations that could change a person's pretrial detention status pretrial. Sure.
Just didn't want to jump over. Thank you for that explanation. And just one example I just like to throw out there. I'm usually the odd person out, right? I don't agree with incarcerating everybody. I don't think everybody needs to be held. But just this weekend, just to share an example, an individual, I guess similar, would fall into one of those buckets of there's not a mandatory hold or not held pre-trial. We had an individual who killed 2 people last year in our Potomac Gardens neighborhood. So this individual traveled to this community, walked in the community with a firearm, discharging it recklessly, killed 2 people. Somebody who was preparing to wash a car and somebody else that was just in the neighborhood. Killed them both, fled the scene. Our detectives ran this case down, excellent case, got an arrest warrant signed. He was arrested, went through everything, and then was released on pretrial. So essentially released on pretrial. That person was killed this weekend in Prince George's County. And Prince George's County reached out to me like, why is this person out? I said, well, we'll check into it. And that's as far as I've gotten with it. But this person was arrested for a double homicide and then released on pretrial. And I don't know about everybody else, but that kind of shocks my conscience a little bit. How you killed 2 people and we release you on pretrial. Just my 2 cents.
So much for sharing that story. I think it's really powerful, and it's an additional layer of heartbreak as we talk about these cycles of trauma that we see so often, perpetrators becoming victims and victims becoming perpetrators. So thank you for sharing that. I want to begin to close us out by raising something that came up a lot from community members over the last several days, and that's about being involved in the process. So there were so many wonderful organizations that spoke up that are doing incredible work. Just 2 of them were Genuine Sisters Supporting Sisters and the Trigger Project. And many of them talked about both a lack of funding or support from the government and needing more of a, grassroots up. I don't like the term bottom up, but grassroots up approach as opposed to government down approach in supporting the organizations that are closest to the people that need support. So I want to ask everybody for thoughts on how we can better engage the community to listen to them, give them supports for what they need, but also follow up, because we continue to hear about this frustration of, we hear a program announced, we hear there's guns recovered or a new VI program, but then we don't see the people, we don't see the impacts in our neighborhoods and our communities, and how we all at this table and on Zoom can do a better job of making sure that next year when we have these conversations or next month, that people aren't feeling that way.
So some people see space disagree or agree. So last week, Christy C-centric violence and It's not to discount the evidence we have regarding success of national models, because I agree that we can pull sets of evidence that work in national models, but I also think some conversations that I've had with people in the CBI space, introduce, for example, from Chicago. CBI kind of check out on that. Chicago, so that's how. And DC is a really unique place, right? And just in terms of where people have the specific issues that may occur, that may not be occurring in other sections of the country. So it's DC centric, but also takes pieces of success from other models across the country. So I think that's where you'll find the most buy-in from residents in the district. Have good ideas. You can pass over those ideas because we have a tendency to just say, well, this works. For example, Chicago cred, which is us, right? We're going to go with the Cure model, or we're going to go with this model, but what you're taking on or not so effectiveness to what was actually doing it was a decent directly model. I think for that. But are also inclusive of what the culture of DC is about. So if we can find some happy medium to create models that look that way, for example, the Trigger Project and other projects that are very organically in DC, I would be open to think about they may have a potential for as much success as we've had with other programs that have been developed in cities across the country.
Granting space, obviously the district does a lot of granting, right? Like I just listed OVSJG, which is $100 million just there, or $10 million in one program at once, or another $10 million in community-based granting at DYRS. We're doing a lot of granting. I think there's some barriers to access. Some of it because we're a government and we have to have certain standards of financial accountability that sometimes preclude some of the organizations that we really want to work with because of what our sort of structures need to be. So we're working on a number of things. One is maybe some standardization in granting, because human beings, they have people they work with. That's just a fact, right? So sometimes what you're seeing is the same organizations getting these grants over and over again, and it can create a feeling in community like you have your favorites, right? Like you guys keep on having your favorites and our voices aren't heard. And so that is part of that process that we're in right now of how do you avoid that? It can't be, some of it is, we just started a capacity building, right? Like a capacity building grant at OBSJG, so that organizations that may not normally be able to access those grants are in the pipeline working on more standardized granting at once in our other organizations. And then, the mayor's tasked all of us with outreach this year. The fact is, as a government, we're not great communicators, and how we do that isn't challenging. I think you often hear a lot about MPD, but if you go to a lot of community meetings, ANCs, they're the ones who are there, right? Like sometimes the only ones. And so I do think it's our responsibility, and I'm charging certainly our agencies with being out there. They're unused to it, some of them, but that's really part of it, is learning to talk to our residents because they don't know what's going on oftentimes unless we tell them. And so we go out and say something, and then it's like, see ya the next time we do a stand up, even though the work is happening, it may or may not be, they don't know because they can't find it anywhere and no one is coming back out. And so that's a big focus for us as a government, is we are here to serve our residents, right? And so we need to, across the board, be out, go to the ANC meetings, right? Like go to the events that are happening so that they see who their government is.
Thank you so much. Councilmember Gray, are you trying to say something?
Well, what was your point,
I couldn't tell if you were trying to say something.
No, I was not. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Thanks so much. Okay, well, I want to be as true to my word as possible with our timing today. And I so appreciate everybody's work and attention to this really important issue. And I just want to give everybody a last opportunity. If there is either a topic that didn't get covered today that you want to highlight, or a closing piece on gun violence reduction and prevention that you want to share. And Dr. OBrien, start with you if you're still on with us, and go to Dr. Webster next, and then we could go around the table. Dr. OBrien, are you still there? Okay, Dr. Webster, are you here? All right, well, Dr. Richardson, please.
They may have had a hard stop at 2. I just think DC has the potential to lead as the nation's capital in violence intervention work. We have all the pieces in place to do the work. I just think the discussions that we've had today in terms of the gaps in regarding sharing information and coordination is really our Achilles heel. And then once we can begin to address those things while also being very inclusive of community in this conversation, it would be great if we didn't have these conversations in silos, right? So it's also important to have policymakers, the community, executive, MPD, universities, all at the table at once. And so we're able to have this exchange while we're all in one place and kind of not communicating and talking over each other because we're in separate silos. So I believe we have the potential to really lead the nation. And again, based on my observations of cities across the country, I actually believe we have far more resources than many of the cities in this country, but we need to just do a better job of the way that we coordinate those resources.
Thank you for this discussion. One thing that I just want to put out there is we, in our office, we have a staff of restorative justice facilitators who've been trained to do restorative justice, to bring together victims of crime and young people and have them resolve their matters. Sometimes the victims of crime are young people themselves, and they have to do a lot of conflict mediation involved in the work. But it was very clear that our young people and the victims of crime are experiencing all sorts of trauma, not just that victimization. And so it was important to us, because of limited resources, as the deputy mayor said about limited resources in terms of therapists or social workers, that we got these services to the people we were working with. And so we had an organization called ROCA, it's based in Massachusetts, now working in Baltimore, come in and train all of our restorative justice facilitators in cognitive behavioral therapy. And we also have a social worker on staff, and he definitely supports victims and young people who are involved in kind of crime and conflict. But now our facilitators are armed with, even though they themselves aren't necessarily therapists or social workers, they have the ability to address some of the trauma and address some of the needs of the people who we're touching. And it seems to me that there are a lot of nonprofit organizations and community groups that really want to help. And I wonder if we could do a better job of arming them with some of the skills and training, maybe in cognitive behavioral therapy, maybe in restorative justice and conflict mediation, so that they themselves are more skilled and able to provide those resources to people that they deal with on a day-to-day basis in their own neighborhoods, including, perhaps university students who have the resources or the ability to come in and do work with communities in DC. And if we don't really have the therapists and the social workers to be able to do this work, then let's provide the training so that other people who do have the time and the ability can help their communities. What we also know is that when communities come together and solve problems, neighborhoods and neighbors, actually crime goes down, but community trust and social cohesion goes up, and people just do better. And so I believe law enforcement tries to, but can also play a role. We're dealing with crime, when somebody hurts somebody else. But there's conflict in neighbors and neighborhoods every day. And those are opportunities to bring in the DC Peace Team or, university students who are now trained in conflict mediation or nonprofits to try and, help communities solve their own problems, build trust, and get stronger in that way. And I wonder if we couldn't think about ways to partner with nonprofits and strengthen nonprofits and residents so that they can be a part of the solution more than just, seeing it and wanting more things done.
Well, thank you again, Chairwoman Pinto, for pulling us all together. I thought it was a terrific panel discussion, and I want to sort of broaden out a little bit and say that I think that the moment is one for leadership, and we are in a political dynamic where it feels nationally, it feels somewhat locally that people want to stop thinking deeply and long and hard about answers and have quick solutions. And there are no quick solutions. There's a lot of hard work that has to get done. And I think there has to be a lot of fortitude in the collectively, all of us as leaders in the community, to push back against what some people would like to assume are quick, easy answers. We can't lock our way out of this problem. We can't prosecute our way out of the problem. We need to remember that we as prosecutors have a job to do. We have to close cases. We have to work with MPD. We have to hold people accountable and do our job in the moment as prosecutors. But if we think the answer is on that front end without doing this hard work that you're leading us in, we're not going to get there. I believe 100% of what Dr. Richardson said. We are so abundant in DC in terms of smart people committed to making the world a fairer, juster place. We got a lot of talent and resources here, and we are committed to collectively doing something about it. I worry that there'll be a failure of leadership. We have a great community. Community is looking to government to sometimes get out of the way because the community's got answers. Government sometimes gets in the way. Our politics is divisive. We've just seen it very recently come home to roost here in Washington. And I fear that that pressure gets us away from having these kinds of conversations about where the real answers are. I think it's in leadership. I think it's in coordination. I think it's as you started the conversation. The leaders in this community are all in for the same result. We all want DC in all of our neighborhoods to be safer. We see the kind of impact it has every day. And we have to stop being political animals and pointing fingers. We have to be more about how do we grab arms together and figure it out. We don't all share every idea or goal. And sometimes in the system, people have appropriate tensions. That's okay. Disagreement is okay too. But I hope that the message that comes out of this is let's keep doing the hard work. Let's do what the people who elected us to do are expecting us to do, which is to keep focused on long-term solutions to long-term problems and not get too caught up in having a soundbite that might make us sound good to some people, but isn't going to advance the conversation.
All right, thank you. So for MPD, we're going to continue to do what we normally do. We're going to be great partners. We're going to work together. We enjoy a great partnership with everybody around this table. We're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to partner with our communities and constantly work to build that legitimacy with our communities. And it takes a hit sometimes when, and I agree, we can't arrest our way out of a situation. But when we do make that arrest, when we arrest that person for that double murder, and they're back out on the street, I don't know what to say about that. We're going to continue doing what we do. I'm going to yield my time over to the deputy mayor because I'm sure she wants to speak, and that's all I have. Thank you.
So what I will say is something that the mayor has said a lot to us in government, to residents, to anyone who will listen, is that there is literally nothing we can't do in the District of Columbia when we do it together. that we have been through some very, very hard things. We kind of, went through looking at the social movements and, the individual things that have happened in our city, the national things that we have gotten through together, right? That we have overcome in our city. And so we find ourselves in a challenging moment, but we've been in challenging moments before. And so what I'll say is this, is that, we love our residents. We love the visitors to our city. We love our city. And so we are going to do everything that we can to make sure that people are safe here and feel safe. And that we continue to be extremely hopeful and optimistic about the future of the district, because we know people are hearing a lot of hard and difficult and dark things. But we really do believe that the best days of our city are just around the corner. And so we're committed to that. We understand that when you hear conversations like this, it's sometimes we will not always agree, but what we all agree on is that we care deeply about our residents and about serving the people who live here and come here across all 8 wards. And so we're committed to continuing to work and to grappling and to do whatever it takes to make sure that everybody in our city is able to thrive.
Thank you. We do very much appreciate, as I said, you holding this roundtable and for hearing all of these perspectives. I think this was an incredible conversation and really got to a lot of the issues that we're all addressing and that we're all facing. We are, certainly committed to combating community-based gun violence, and this is the top of our minds every day. I did want to also highlight the other types of violence that people experience throughout our community, domestic violence, sexual assault, and other types of violence that people are experiencing and have been experiencing for a long time, with a gun, without a gun, and our deep commitment to those issues as well. When we were talking about how we're working with children, what I was thinking of was the child victims that we see and how we can all be supportive of those children. They might be intentional or unintentional victims. They might be direct or indirect victims who have witnessed this and who have to live with that and can handle the trauma, and how we're addressing all of this trauma. And I think everybody's coming at this from a really fantastic perspective of how can we address this trauma in the community, in the communities are experiencing, that the children are experiencing, and that people coming out of abusive situations are experiencing, to help our community heal and be on a path to better community safety. So we really do look forward to continuing to work with you on those issues, on gun violence in general. And we are a partner with everyone in the community. So thank you.
Yes, echoing Ms. Suttenberg, thank you for the conversation, and for the Superior Court Division. We have many prosecutors who dedicate their days to combating violent crime in the city, and we're not going to prosecute our way out of this, but we are absolutely open to any ways that we can do our jobs better. And we are committed to listening and hearing, and we know we can always improve. We want to become more data-driven. We are very fortunate to have a group of advocates and attorneys and staff who are every day meeting with people who have experienced this extraordinary amount of trauma. Seeing how it affects the daily lives of so many in DC. So we are very committed to doing our part as prosecutors and being a part of the solution.
Well, thank you all so much. And I want to thank my team and my committee staff for working so hard, really around the clock, to organize this 3-day roundtable and making sure that we can hear from members of the community, providing a virtual option, meeting members of the community at the Anacostia Library on Saturday, and convening this forum today to hear from our government partners and other national experts in this work. So thank you all. And I'll just say, on behalf of my team and I with this committee, from our perspective, we believe all of the voices that we heard in these last 3 days are centrally important to this effort to reduce and prevent gun violence, whether that be parents we heard from, community organizations, our prosecutors, our experts, our police, our deputy mayor, and everybody doing this important intervention work. And I pledge that we will continue leaning into this work to figure out how we can empower and support all of the work that you all are doing, help in better coordination, and fill the gaps when they do exist. Some of these are legislative gaps that we've talked about today that I am absolutely committed to. Some of them are funding challenges.
Some of them are coordination challenges, and I know that with all of us leaned into doing more and better of what we have been doing and thinking outside the box, we can make a bigger impact here, and we're going to continue to try every day. So I really appreciate all that you all are doing for participating so earnestly and openly in this discussion. I'm looking forward to working with all of you as we go through these next 2 years. Thank you. It being 2:18 p.m. on Monday, March 6th, there being no more business before the committee.